Crimea is on the verge of catastrophe, because this time, Ukraine has made all Russian assets in Crimea its target board, and Kerch Bridge is right in the middle of that target board. Ukraine's Lance is a massive 7-ton missile with a 1,150-kilogram warhead. On the morning of August 30th, 3 long-range cruise missiles, each weighing 7 tons, were fired in succession from the coastline. A few minutes later, they exploded in the north of the peninsula. On the same day, swarms of drones opened a new window by probing air defense gaps. Then came the official announcement of a crisis at the Simferopol airbase and the blinded S-400 radar. The first recorded threshold was the Armyansk line on the morning of August 30. News feeds from Ukrainian sources reported that an FSB border guard post and a nearby patrol boat facility had been hit. This detail was reinforced by local eyewitness accounts and OSINT images. A video of a triple cruise missile launch from the coast, broadcast in the same window, showed that the launches were sequential and that the flight corridors progressed along a planned route. Another threshold was observed on the Simferopol side on the same day. At around 9:30 on August 30th, drone activity was reported in the direction of Simferopol airport. Platforms monitoring the drone's approach to the area soon shared images of a fire near the airport. By the end of the day, information about the destruction of 2 Russian helicopters was gathered by the OSINT community and local media. Preliminary data obtained by comparing satellite images shows that the Mi-8 and Mi-24 helicopters were destroyed in the fire. This cycle continued with the S-400 radars being disabled. On August 30th, military intelligence reported that additional components of the S-400 family, including various radar and communication systems, such as the 96L6AP radar, had been disabled in Crimea. Local media also reported that coastal surveillance elements and a GLONASS-based facility were hit in the same package. This content shows that the Air Defense Plus Command Control Plus Navigation triad was targeted at the same time. The destruction of an FSB facility on the Crimean northern line with cruise missiles was actually a loud warning sent to a single target. That warning was, Kerch, be ready. Because Ukraine has now deployed domestically produced long-range cruise missiles that combine range, payload, and accuracy in the same sentence, its name is Flamingo. With a range of 3,000 kilometers, a warhead of approximately 1,150 kilograms, and a mobile launch architecture, it poses a challenge to the layers of Crimea's defense. The FSB base was the first curtain raiser for this profile. The real pressure is building in Kerch. The Kremlin senses this. The series of fires in Crimea has completely changed the current risk map of the most sensitive point of the Black Sea Azov logistics, namely the Kerch Bridge. What we are discussing today is more than a single strike. It is the birth of a regime of continuous pressure. The short way to understand this change is this. The range is now longer than the geography. The warhead is now as heavy as concrete, and the launch point is now as flexible as movement. The pace that Crimea's air defense has been able to withstand until now was limited to cheap threats and single-vector tests. Flamingo adds heavy, persistent, and multi-axis pressure on top of this pace. Moreover, its domestic production nature provides freedom of use unhindered by third-party constraints. This freedom makes the answer to the question, when and where, more uncertain for the defense side. Uncertainty is the most costly issue for defense, because every uncertainty requires additional personnel, additional batteries, additional patrols, and additional budget. The flames seen around Crimea on the morning of August 30th indicated that this budget would increase, but that the real bill would be paid in Kerch. The strike on the FSB facility in North Crimea and the accompanying naval element showed that a technical window had opened. The burning of helicopters parked in Simferopol during the same time window was another sign of temporary blind spots in the air picture. Even a few hours of interruption could be enough for a long-range missile flying at low altitude, hugging the terrain, and with a low sonar profile to use the window. Therefore, the FSB base was not an end, but a beginning. The message was clear. I take off from the coast, enter at low altitude, and pierce through. A single hit is not enough to make such a statement, but seeing damage images in 3 separate layers in a single day indicates layer fatigue. Fatigue is a word that directly faces Kerch. The Flamingo missile is a domestic cruise platform with a range of 3,000 kilometers, a warhead weighing over a ton, and high accuracy. In other words, a Flamingo missile launched from Kiev, Ukraine, could target many Russian cities, including Moscow, and destroy many factories that feed Russia's war industry in minutes. The FSB base is a cover. The file inside is Kerch. The Kerch Bridge has been one of the most symbolic and real targets of this war for years. Symbolic because it produces a political image. Real because it connects the Azov basin with the Russian mainland's land logistics in a single line. If the lines are broken, the rest of the map becomes meaningless for a while. Until now, the bridge has been tested by methods coming from the sea and underwater. It has sometimes suffered heavy damage, sometimes been quickly patched up. But now, a new layer has been added to the picture. A domestic long-range weapon that can approach from land, from protected areas, from multiple axes at low altitude, operating with a high-impact sustainable quantity balance. This layer changes not only the question of where to strike the bridge, but also how often it will be challenged. That's why Flamingo doesn't need to be marketed as a game changer. A 1,150 kilogram warhead is heavy enough to be a plan changer. Thinking in terms of how many hits does it take to destroy the bridge is incorrect, and one must never fall into the trap of issuing tactical instructions. Nevertheless, there is a technical reality. A payload in the 1-ton warhead class, combined with the right type of ammunition and accuracy, will result in lengthy repairs and partial closure of the bridge piers, deck beams, or deck. This closure could mean days or weeks. The plan, type, and accuracy vary depending on the geometry. This is where Flamingo's discipline comes to the fore. The combination of low altitude, terrain following, and mobile launch means that its origin remains instantaneously ambiguous. Ambiguity requires the defense to be equally thick everywhere. The defense cannot be equally thick everywhere. No one can. That's why the bridge is no longer a one-shot surprise. It's an element of persistent pressure.
Ебать! Твою мать, блядь!
Ukraine virtually leveled Russia's most strategic airbase in Kursk, Kalino, with 7 ATACMS missiles. Footage showed the explosions of the ATACMS missiles illuminating the night sky. Footage taken from inside a vehicle by airbase personnel also revealed the characteristic moment of the M74 submunition exploding on the airbase's grounds. The sparks from the missiles created a deep sense of panic at the airbase. The fact that the ATACMS missiles were able to strike Kalino, 96 kilometers from the border, so easily caused astonishment throughout Russia. The Russians claimed that there were 8 ATACMS targeting Kalino and stated that 7 of them were shot down. But everything was out in the open. The sounds of explosions and air raid sirens proved what the ATACMS had actually done to Kalino. These ATACMS attacks on the Kalino airbase in Kursk were part of the Ukrainian army's plan targeting the Crimean peninsula, which Russia had annexed. Kiev actually intended to direct the ATACMS missiles at Russian military assets in Crimea. Crimea has been purged of Russian air power. There are no Su-35s or MiG-31s here anymore. Only empty Russian air bases remain. Putin was helpless because the name of the threat was ATACMS. ATACMS missiles arrived silently, striking, and even the S-400s were helpless. Ukraine has now dominated the Crimean peninsula with ATACMS missiles for a long time. In other words, Kiev was executing its plan flawlessly. Djangoi, Saki, and Belbek air bases became targets for these missiles during the 2024 to 2025 period. Kiev actually signaled what it could do in the future, with these missiles starting in the summer of 2024 in Crimea. In May, the Belbek airbase was hit by American-made ATACMS missiles. An ATACMS missile was fired with great force at the Belbek airbase, located 230 kilometers from the front lines in southern Ukraine. The missile penetrated the Russian air defense system all the way to Belbek, causing an incredible explosion at the airbase. High-resolution satellite images released after the attack showed that 1 MiG-31 and 3 Su-27 fighter jets were completely destroyed, while one MiG-29 was severely damaged. Deep burn marks and debris accumulation were observed in the refueling area right next to the main runway. This area is known to be a vital point in terms of operational cycle. The same images also revealed dark stains not previously present in the parking areas and structural damage to the outer edges of the aircraft shelters. Open-source intelligence sources shared photos indicating that an S-300/S-400 air defense system stationed in Belbek had been hit. It is understood that the 92N6 Gravestone radar, a critical radar component of the S-400, was targeted, and this loss is considered to have created a serious gap in Russian air defense integrity. After this attack, noticeable changes occurred in the layout of Belbek. The construction of heavily fortified shelters accelerated, aircraft were moved further inland, and the density of the parking area was deliberately reduced. Thus, the difference between the visible power of a base and its real power became apparent for the first time in such a clear manner. Russian forces on the peninsula suspect that the Ukrainian army could also carry out ATACMS attacks on the Kerch Bridge. If ATACMS missiles hit Kerch and destroy the bridge, this 19-kilometer logistics artery could spell the end for both Russian forces in Crimea and the Kremlin. Let's briefly discuss the power of ATACMS. ATACMS is an INS GPS-guided ballistic munition fired from M142 HIMARS and M270 MLRS launchers. The core body is 0.61 meters in diameter and approximately 4 meters long, shortening the interception window with a steep and rapid terminal dive angle after launch. The M39/M39 A1 variants carry M74 submunitions with a range of 165 to 300 kilometers and produce a wide area effect in open parking lots and around runways. The M48/M57 variants carry a single-piece, approximately 500-pound Class HE unitary warhead with a range of 270 to 300 kilometers and are suitable for hard targets such as fuel depots, radar nodes, command facilities, and bridge approaches. While HIMARS carries a single ATACMS in a pod, the M270 keeps two missiles ready at the same time. The shoot-and-scoot doctrine allows for rapid position change after firing. GPS-aided accuracy can reach the single-digit to low double-digit meter range, enabling sustained pressure in saturated wave configurations in layered air defense zones like Crimea. Meanwhile, the ATACMS strike on the Belbek base in Crimea was not an isolated incident. On April 17, 2024, the Djangoi airbase at the northern tip of Crimea was also targeted by a similar ATACMS attack. Known as one of the centers of frontline operations due to its proximity to Donbass, this base had long been on Ukraine's radar. Satellite images shared by Planet Labs after the attack confirmed extensive damage in the area south of the base where the S-400/S-300 batteries are located. At least 4 main components were completely destroyed. Burn marks in the surrounding area indicated that the attack had a wider impact. It became clear that the missiles were aimed not only at air defense systems, but also at Djangoi's 2 main runways. Hard ground areas east of the base were also targeted, with extensive burn marks in the area where some Pantsir S-1 or similar short-range air defense vehicles were located. Images indicated that these systems had either been directly hit or damaged by the explosions.
Получается, из-за того, что с двух сторон отбойники, как бы 3 ряда, вот этот ряд.
Trains are stopped in Crimea. Military convoys cannot pass through Kerch. The bridge is not being dismantled, but the arteries are suddenly spasming. Trucks, wagons, and tankers are being held up. Panic is everywhere. People are in dire straits, because the ammunition supply for the army protecting them has been cut off. Explosives and fuel destined for Crimea are stuck at stations on the Russian mainland. People are looking on with concern because the next alarm could completely close the Kerch Bridge. And both Russian residents and the Russian army in Crimea are aware of this. So, is it necessary to destroy a bridge to take it out of the game? You don't necessarily have to destroy a bridge to take it out of the game. The inability of Russian trains to pass through to Crimea safely, the ban on dangerous cargo, lanes closing for minutes at every alarm, and a single underwater explosion keeping engineers chained to their desks for months. All of this explains how Ukraine paralyzed the Kerch Bridge in just 3 strikes. According to Vasyl Malyuk, head of the Ukrainian Security Service, the Kerch Bridge is currently operating at limited capacity. In particular, vehicles weighing over 5 tons are not permitted to cross. In other words, the bridge is unusable for military logistics. However, to understand this breaking point more clearly, we need to rewind the film. Ukraine carried out 3 successful attack operations targeting the Crimean bridge between 2022 and 2025. In October 2022, the first major explosion shattered the road deck. Fuel tankers on the side of the road caught fire. Traffic was partially restored shortly afterward. But the bridge entered a cautious operational regime for the first time, lasting for months. The second blow came in July 2023. The attack was carried out from the sea by the 13th Main Directorate of the Military Counterintelligence Directorate of the Ukrainian Security Service. Approximately 200 surface-type unmanned sea vehicles were used in the operation. Road sections were damaged again, and repairs took months. Fully reopened, announcements always came with a caveat: speed limits, weight restrictions, and phased traffic flow. And on June 3, 2025, an underwater attack this time targeted the bridge's support structure. 2 explosions, each equivalent to 100 tons of TNT, occurred. The confirmation of the underwater method signaled a technical adaptation continuing from previous surface drones. Open sources showed that new routes had been found despite boom barriers blocking approach angles to the bridge. This indicates not the continuity but the uncertainty of the attacks, which has now infiltrated the defense plan. While the Ukrainian Security Service claimed responsibility for the attack, the bridge was closed and reopened several times that day. The next day, traffic restrictions were tightened again. These 3 strikes solidified a fragile reality rather than causing destruction. Even when we say we are open, questions of how and to what extent began to cast a shadow over every convoy. Repairing the bridge is easy, but who will ensure the risk for that bridge? Even if the bridge appears to be technically operational, another invisible meter has come into play on the ground. Reliability. The true strength of a logistics artery cannot be reduced to the simplicity of, did it pass or not? The trio of predictable passage, acceptable risk premium, and the capacity of alternative routes determines the overall impact. This is why the British Defence Intelligence Assessment in late 2023 was so harsh. The bridge had become a security burden for Moscow. Defense elements connecting air to land and sea to shore were locking in personnel and firepower needed on other fronts via the Kerch Strait. Civilian sector steps also underscored this assessment. The gradual shift of heavy truck and fuel traffic to ferries revealed the fragility behind the official narrative. Is the word open always reliable in military parlance? On the ground, day by day, even hour by hour, alarm closures became the new normal. Closures lasting a few hours took a toll on drivers' nerves more than the bridge's concrete. When a bridge closes twice in a row, the convoy commander changes his plan, not his schedule. At this point, the language of engineering comes into play. Every impact affecting the support structure triggers a reassessment of static and fatigue calculations. This means additional inspections for heavy hazardous loads, reduced speed limits, and new checks after every tremor. There is no destruction, but there is an uncertainty eroding the safety margin. In other words, it is not a part of the bridge that is damaged, but its functionality. Ukraine has dealt a major blow to the Russian Air Force. 5 Russian warplanes were shot down over Crimea. Each one is now a pile of scrap metal worth approximately $35 to $50 million, lying in smoke along the Black Sea coast. This is not just an operation, it is a strategic loss. But the real question begins here. How did Ukraine lure this massive air force into a trap? On the morning of August 4th, the skies over Crimea once again echoed with Ukraine's unmanned aerial attacks. However, this time, what happened was far beyond the ordinary. This was not a reconnaissance patrol. It was a targeted, meticulously planned raid designed to paralyze a major airbase. The target was the Saki airbase, one of Russia's largest and most well-equipped air bases in Crimea. This base was crucial for maintaining air superiority over the Black Sea, launching airstrikes on southern Ukrainian cities like Kherson and Mykolaiv, and serving as the heart of Russian aviation operations in the region. The 43rd Separate Naval Assault Aviation Regiment, stationed at the base, played a key role in military operations in the region. Every day, Su-30 SM fighter jets took off from here. Su-24 bomber jets changed course to conduct penetration flights, and ground radars were fed with false targets. But on August 4th, this routine was disrupted. The Special Operations Center, affiliated with the Ukrainian Security Service, launched the attack on this strategic location following months of reconnaissance, frequency monitoring, and airflow analysis. First, numerous long-range UAVs with low radar signatures surrounded the Saki base. Some UAVs used false routes to create radar jamming, while the main wave targeted launch pads, aircraft parking areas, and ammunition depots directly. According to hit records, one Su-30SM fighter jet was completely destroyed. Another Su-30SM sustained severe damage. 3 Su-24 bomber aircraft were rendered inoperable. The main ammunition depot caught fire. Explosions continued for hours. The type of UAVs used by Ukraine in this attack has not been officially disclosed. However, based on technical data, it is estimated that these vehicles are equipped with high-resolution electro-optical targeting systems and special guidance software resistant to GNSS jamming. Additionally, the fact that the attack vectors came from different directions within the same time window indicates that coordination was carried out through an AI-supported network. Why Saki? Saki Air Base is not just a runway for aircraft. It also serves as the control center for air reconnaissance missions in the Black Sea, the central hub for electronic warfare systems, and a key logistics supply chain node for air defense batteries across Crimea. Even a temporary shutdown of this base would mean a significant weakening of Russian air presence in the northwestern part of the Black Sea. The Su-30SM, in particular, is the backbone of the Russian Air Force's multi-role mission load. Moscow developed this aircraft as a response to NATO's F-15. It is twin-engine, multi-role, and long-range. It can strike both air and ground targets, refuel in mid-air, guide strategic bombers, and serve as a flying command center when necessary. Su-24s are primarily used for low-altitude bombing and can carry heavy munitions such as the Kh-29, Kh-58. On paper, it was invincible, but on the runway, it wasn't. The Su-30SM's mission was to detect the enemy from a distance and eliminate it. The possibility of being left defenseless on the battlefield was never considered in the design of this platform. The destruction of these aircraft deals a blow to Russia's ability to attack long-range targets. ATACMS strikes against the peninsula continued during the summer months. In June 2024, ATACMS missiles targeted the NIP-16 Deep Space Communication Facility in the city of Vitino. This facility, now known as the 40th Separate Command and Measurement Complex, is part of the Titov Main Test and Space Systems Control Center, which is affiliated with the Russian Aerospace Forces. Built during the Cold War, the structure was used for years to track Soviet and Russian space missions. However, it is no longer just a monitoring facility, it also serves as an active center for command and control operations. The attack was carried out in 2 waves. In the first wave, the section containing approximately 20 large antenna dishes, the facility's most prominent feature, was targeted. Some of these dishes were arranged in large octagonal arrays and played a critical role in both military satellite communications and the management of space missions. Satellite imagery clearly showed burn marks across the large open area in this region, particularly over a short distance to the east. Similar signs of blackened soil and structural damage were detected north and east of the octagonal antenna array. The regular positioning of the burn areas indicates that the attack targeted specific radar electronic infrastructure. The strike on NIP-16 is not just physical damage. It represents a direct blow to Russia's military space architecture and long-range command capabilities. Another strike was recorded at another airfield in July 2024, indicating that all bases within range were under pressure. New satellite images around Saki showed fresh crater marks and burn marks in areas outside the facility. The story behind the arrival of the ATACMS that achieved these successes in Ukraine is also quite noteworthy. Volodymyr Zelensky announced to the public in 2023 that the US had provided ATACMS to the Ukrainian armed forces. This announcement was confirmed shortly thereafter by the US National Security Council. On the same day, Ukraine deployed this system in combat for the first time. 2 separate airports in Berdyansk and Luhansk were struck by short-range ATACMS missiles. Footage shared on social media showed at least 6 missiles being fired from the M142 HIMARS system. These first batches were mostly the 165-kilometer range M39A1 type, i.e., the short-range version. However, this step signified crossing a threshold in the profile of support the West was providing to Ukraine in the war. From that moment on, ATACMS became not just ammunition, but a geopolitical message and an element of strategic balance. In the months that followed, the shipment of missiles and the management of ammunition stocks were intensely debated in both Kyiv and Washington. In the spring of 2024, deliveries of advanced variants with a range of up to 300 kilometers began. The political limit set by the US during this period was clear: Ukraine could only use these missiles over its own occupied territories. In other words, attacks on Russia's mainland were not possible with these weapons. However, this situation did not last long. By early 2025, signs began to emerge that some of the ATACMS provided by the US to Ukraine included modified and upgraded long-range models. This development marked a critical threshold in the course of the war. Kyiv now had an effective and sustainable deterrent at its disposal, capable of precision strikes at greater distances. As the range increased, the map changed. If political will strengthens further and the US decides to deploy the PRSM family, the new generation derivatives of ATACMS, these systems with a range of 500 kilometers will reach a point where they threaten Russia's A2/AD networks deep within its territory. Command centers along the Crimea-Rostov line, logistics arteries around Kerch, missile radar systems, and air bases would now become fixed targets. This is because Russia's southern logistics depend on two main corridors, the Kerch Bridge and the railway road extending to the peninsula via Melitopol-Djangoi. ATACMS is not a direct one-shot, one-kill solution for Kerch. However, intermittent strikes on soft targets such as bridge approach ramps, railway junctions, signaling areas, fuel, supply storage, and locomotive parks can permanently reduce total capacity. Ukraine has already increased the cost of defending Kerch since the summer of 2024. The damage the bridge has sustained from previous attacks and repeated closures has demonstrated how risky the single artery dependency is. The ATACMS range also allows you to target the railway junctions through which cargo enters Crimea. The pressure on Djangoi is a typical example of this. If the radar eye and fuel rail junctions are strained within the same week, the frequency of trains at convoys returning from Rostov to Crimea decreases. Each decrease increases the need for and cost of forward storage. This thins the buffers in the flow of ammunition and fuel approaching the front. Thinner buffers make it harder for the front to maintain its tempo during surprise night operations. A rhythm that forces Crimea's air and logistics network to operate at half capacity every week incurs three permanent costs for the Russian side: air defense ammunition component consumption, repair hardening investment, and freight insurance premium differences. The cost of 48 N6/9 M96 class interception munitions and the cost asymmetry of the ATACMS UAV mix create a reverse leverage effect on the defender's budget. 24 interception fires in one night can result in a multiplier bill for the attacking side's expenditure on UAVs, plus several ballistics. Shelter and distributed fuel investments reflected in satellite imagery mean continuous increases in concrete, steel, and labor costs. This investment may reduce destruction, but does not eliminate the cost. The increased risk of attacks on ports, roads, and railways around Crimea triggers not only temporary transportation disruptions, but also a systematic cost spiral. Every possibility of attack translates into a direct insurance problem for carriers and logistics companies. This causes insurance companies to raise premiums. Moreover, this increase applies not only to traditional transportation, but also to alternative transportation structures known as the shadow fleet, established to circumvent sanctions. So even if the name of the risk changes, the market prices this cost in any case. The ripple effect of this cost is multi-layered. Every attack or sabotage means that the damaged infrastructure is out of service during the repair period. This adds delays to the transport chain on an hourly or daily basis. Every hour of delay extends delivery times, which in turn leads to order cancellations or compensation penalties due to the failure of both intermediate goods and final products to arrive on time. At the same time, this situation directly affects the inventory management of manufacturers or suppliers. For the defense industry in particular, such logistical disruptions turn into a serious planning crisis. Since the sustainability of the front line depends on the continuity of ammunition and spare parts flow, even if alternative routes are created for such risky lines, complete security cannot be guaranteed. This forces military planners to carry more forward stock. In other words, the required ammunition and parts must be sent to the front in advance and in larger quantities than expected. However, this situation requires increasing storage capacity, raising the transport volume of the logistics chain, and tying cash flow to these pre-transported stocks. In other words, a serious relaxation of financial discipline is emerging in the name of the sustainability of the war. This scenario affects not only the transport chain but also the fixed infrastructure itself. Hardening investments initiated after losses at facilities such as Belbek Air Base are directly included in the budget. Although these construction activities create some employment and spending for the local economy, in military terms, the cost-benefit curve is often negative. This is because these investments do not prevent attacks, they only attempt to mitigate their impact. And this is not sustainable. News about air bases and bridges creates a perception of constant fragility, not only operationally, but also in civilian psychology. Flight bans, traffic restrictions, temporary bridge closures, and the alert regime in coastal defense periodically disrupt daily life on the peninsula. Tourism, retail, and small businesses are directly affected by this fluctuation. The tension between the budget allocated for repairs and social services grows. As emergency shelter and critical day stockpiling behaviors become widespread among the resident population, the definition of normal recedes in a way that is difficult to regain. Rotation and leave plans for military families become more uncertain. Uncertainty breeds fatigue. Semi-permanent migration flows within and outside Crimea intensify. This creates a second wave of pressure on civilian infrastructure. As the defense rhetoric hardens, the civilians' daily response may become detached from the language of politics. This disconnect is the unseen cost of a long war. The most critical outcome of ATACMS pressure is the inability to give a clear answer to the question, when. Defense must remain constantly on alert. This vigilance diminishes personnel's attention and decision-making quality over time. Small mistakes can have major consequences on critical nights. Withdrawing bases inward and reducing aircraft visibility provides fertile ground for the propaganda narrative that the planes are scared. The defense side responds with the "we are protecting ourselves" framework. Partial closures of bridges and rail lines repeatedly convey the message that transportation is fragile to both civilians and military personnel. Crimea's status as a political symbol turns every strike into a major headline. This is the multiplier of psychological impact. The attrition strategy produces a more stable pressure graph than a single night of victory. As society becomes accustomed to the alarm, it fixes the new normal at a lower expectation. This is an advantage for the side of the war that plays in favor of time. So what is Russia doing? In the short term, it is responding with defense, broader false targets, intense EW, distributed fuel, relocatable radars, and shelters. In the medium term, the focus is on thickening anti-drone, anti-surface layers around Kerch, creating backup routes on rail lines, and shortening the reaction time of repair engineering units. In the long term, new lines that would reduce dependence on a single artery are discussed in theory. In practice, cost, time, and security limit this. In the political sphere, the rhetoric of expanding the buffer zone has been part of the Kremlin's line since April 2024. However, the logistical and manpower implications of this rhetoric are already constrained by high attrition rates on the Ukrainian front. The protection of Crimea remains one of the steepest cost-risk curves. In short, Crimea is not just a strategic piece of land on the map. It has also become the nerve center of Russia's security narrative, its claim to military capability, and its geopolitical prestige. Every successful strike with ATACMS missiles hits not only a target, but also the Kremlin's capacity to balance the costs of war. Because now every attack creates a wide range of effects, from economic balances to civilian psychology, from military mobility to foreign policy rhetoric, not just a runway or radar system. Every new explosion in Crimea shows that Russia is bleeding a little more in its war of attrition, that its patience is running out as much as its ammunition. If this rhythm continues and Western support remains uninterrupted, holding Crimea may become not only strategically but also mathematically impossible, and this possibility could be the beginning of an end that Moscow is not prepared for. The strike on the FSB base in Crimea was the first rhetoric of this persistence. We saw the phrase, "Look, the new range is in play," accompanied by flames and smoke. The second half of this sentence is much more critical. Now look at the bridge. If it is not looked at now, it will be looked at tomorrow. If it is not looked at tomorrow, it will be looked at again with every round of persistent pressure. Because range is no longer a limitation, it is a possibility. The payload is no longer, "I pierced it lightly," it is, "I can cause permanent damage." The mobile launcher is no longer somewhere on the shore. It is on the shore in the inner depths, present while being transported and while being hidden. When these three pieces come together, the bridge defense's statement must change. It wants to protect everywhere, but it cannot fully protect anywhere. This is the political power of the Flamingo. There are many things it can do, but not all at once. First, physical hardening and deception around the bridge. Second, densifying the low-altitude radar network and increasing the number of short-range interceptors. Third, intensifying electronic jamming. Fourth, moving command centers to more dispersed and deeper locations. Fifth, accelerating reconnaissance attack cycles aimed at hunting down launch points. Yes, all of these are technically possible, but each is expensive, each requires trained personnel, and each requires spare parts and maintenance cycles. All of these, when combined, reduce the risk, but they do not eliminate it. And they cannot all be done at the same time. When you pull a battery deeper inland, you leave a gap near the front line. When you move a radar to the bridge area, you pull it over an airfield. When you pile pantsirs into Kerch, you reduce the density around the port. This is a game of three-card Monty. When you close one, you open another. Flamingo thrives precisely in the open spots of this game. But what if defense completely solves this? It doesn't completely solve it. Even the world's thickest air defenses cannot achieve zero leakage against low-altitude, multi-axis, and salvo combinations, especially when the striking instrument is portable and used with cheap threats. Recent events on the Crimean front already show that the layers are fatigued and blind spots are forming at short intervals. Helicopter fires, radar and communication losses, the fire at the FSB facility. These are not individual events. Together, they are meaningful. When read together, they say one thing about Kerch's fate. You will be constantly tested. In other words, before the main window for using a long-range system like Flamingo, the S-400 layer is weakened. Radar and communication networks are cut off. Then cruise strikes are launched with a higher probability of success. Once the cycle is successful, it can be replicated. Once replicated, it becomes sustainable. When it becomes sustainable, high-value targets like Kerch become vulnerable not only symbolically, but operationally. A bridge under constant test is one of the highest priority targets. If politics cannot bear this weight, it changes the plan. When planning changes, the rhythm on the front line drops. Rhythm is the most expensive resource in war. The fundamental problem Russia faces today is related to maintaining rhythm. Maintaining rhythm on extended lines requires constantly balancing the heavy load. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, manpower, training hours, maintenance intervals. Kerch is the gasket of this balance. If it leaks, every item closes with increasing costs. This is why it is expensive for a long-range missile around Crimea to exert persistent pressure, rather than one-night pressure. Flamingo exists not to knock down a large target with every shot, but to disrupt this rhythm. When you disrupt the rhythm, you reduce the quality of every decision made by the other side. As quality decreases, small, irreversible chains form on the front line. In a bridge-targeted scenario, the critical word is repeat. The cost of repetition increases not for the attacker, but for the defender. The attacker seeks a window with a similar cost on each attempt. The defender pays for a new battery, a new patrol, a new radar, a new bridge reinforcement, and a new insurance premium on each attempt. The premium is paid not only for the bridge, but for every secondary line that feeds it. This becomes the visible item on the invisible bill of war. Every new risk that falls on Kerch casts a shadow over ports, ferries, and rail lines. The shadow reads as slowdown in the economy. The slowdown is felt as delay in the field. At this point, the debate, is Flamingo expensive or cheap, comes to the fore. The exact figures for unit costs are not public, but the platform philosophy is clear. Sufficiently sophisticated, repeatable, field-compatible. The political meaning of this triad is sustainable pressure. Sustainable pressure does not mean a single big flare-up in a month. It means small flares every week, short sirens every night, short delays every day. The picture emerging in Crimea points precisely to such a rhythm. Every brief interval when air defenses are breached is an invitation to long-range strikes. As the invitation is accepted, the defense spends more, tires more, and wears down more. The worn-down system collapses unexpectedly one night. The Kremlin wants to maintain the image of deterrence, but that image no longer walks on the bridge deck. The image is not as solid as the thick iron bars built on the bridge piers. Because the basis of deterrence is the myth of invulnerability, it is not a single blow that shatters the myth, it is repeated pressure. The strike on the FSB base in Crimea was a thick mark drawn on this myth. The subsequent losses of helicopters and S-400 radars turned that mark into a letter. That letter reads, Kerch. This sound reached the decision-making rooms in Moscow. The question now being asked in those decision-making rooms is not, how many batteries are enough? But, which batteries can we pull from where? This question itself is an admission. Could Kerch be completely destroyed? Technical jargon says this. The right type of warhead, the right impact points, and sufficient repetition can effectively disable the bridge for a long time. In some scenarios, it can jeopardize its structural integrity. The phrase, effectively disabled, is important here, because in war, the goal is often not total destruction, but long-term closure. Long shutdowns increase transportation costs, disrupt supply chains, disrupt personnel planning, and undermine morale. Flamingo's range and payload parameters make this long shutdown target realistic. This realism produces political consequences. Defense starts talking about how much rather than why. What about international pressure? Of course it increases. Because destroying a high-level political symbol could take the war beyond Ukraine's borders. Naturally, the West does not want to risk this possibility. But this pressure does not eliminate the range and payload Ukraine has created, and Ukraine's bargaining window becomes more visible. When the curtain rises, other targets are mentioned along with the bridge. It is unnecessary to name them, but when words like fuel, command, and communication appear side by side, everyone understands which points have entered the risk pool. The voices mocking Flamingo's pink story may be leaning on the emotional fatigue of war. But the metal on the ground speaks the language of physical value, not mockery. When range mathematics, warhead physics, and launch architecture come together, what emerges is not a joke, but reality. Reality is the burning of the FSB facility. Reality is the burning of helicopters. Reality is the failure of radar and communication elements. And the sum of these realities makes the bridge more fragile than ever. Fragility grows not with a single blow, but with persistent pressure. Is Crimea's defense now under a new penetration regime? Yes, because in one day we saw damage in 3 different areas, and in the same week the loss of critical nodes in the air defense network was announced. This was the first week of the penetration regime. As this regime continues, the pressure line on the bridge thickens. Day or night, but every day and every night, part of the defense's attention is locked on the bridge. If Kerch closes overnight, what happens to the front? The answer is not measured in kilometers alone. Decision quality declines. Routes diversify, protection strips are thickened, loads are transferred, ferry and ship alternatives exceed capacity, and railway plans are rewritten. All this is done, but at a cost. The cost is delay. Delays are not visible line by line on the front, but they accumulate in soldiers, fuel, spare parts, ammunition, and food items, eventually manifesting as a significant gap in a single day. This is the strategic impact of the Flamingo. It increases the likelihood of this gap day by day. What happened in Crimea this week can be summarized in a single message: immunity is over. This sentence is constructed not for grandstanding, but for planning. The first step in planning is, Kerch will be tested again and again. The second step, defense will become more expensive with each test. The third step, at some point, politics will lose the balance between cost and image. The fourth step, the momentum will shift in favor of the striking side. If these 4 lines were written, the title of the remaining pages is clear: The Flamingo Effect. In conclusion, the FSB facility you saw burning in Crimea was only a small part of this story. The real story will be written in Kerch. A 3,000-kilometer range, a 1,150-kilogram warhead, and a mobile launch system turned the difficult but possible period for the bridge into a persistent and expensive one. The Crimean defense did not collapse, it was breached. Even if the breach is closed, it will reopen. Because the striking side now has tempo, not just a one-off show. This tempo is what the defense hates most. Tempo shortens the decision time, increases the margin of error, and disrupts the rhythm. And whoever disrupts the rhythm sets the agenda. Kerch is at the top of today's agenda. This line is becoming bolder rather than fading. Because this time, the message was written not for a single day, but for many days. Now let's record the question in its clearest form. Can Ukraine now easily target Crimea, and Kerch in particular? Yes, because range is not an obstacle. Yes, because the warhead is heavy enough to create a kill zone, and mobile launchers create unpredictability. Furthermore, fatigue in air defense leaves blind spots at short intervals. Now, persistent pressure is accelerating the transformation of the bridge from a symbol to a weak link. Would a military train cross that bridge without an engineer's signature? By spring 2024, the picture became clear. Due to hazardous cargo restrictions, over 2,000 tanker cars were stranded on the North Caucasus Railway for weeks. The solution was to increase ferry and tanker shipments. The message on the table was clear. The everything goes through the bridge era was over. Ukrainian SBU head Vasyl Malyuk stated in March 2024 that the bridge was not actually being used to transport ammunition, with the daily number of trains dropping to 4-5, primarily carrying passengers. During the same period, the OSINT community Molfar reported that they had not observed any freight trains carrying military equipment in satellite images. While some of these claims were dismissed as propaganda by opposing media, the behavior on the ground spoke volumes on its own. So where is Russia's logistics breathing from? The answer becomes clear when following the map along the southern coastal strip. The lines stretching from Taganrog to Mariupol and from Berdyansk to Melitopol were rapidly put into operation throughout 2024-2025. In some areas, complete reconstruction was carried out, while in others, improvements were made. However, these alternative routes closer to and more exposed to Ukrainian fire. In other words, every gain is balanced by another risk. The strategy of reducing dependence on Kerch looks smart on paper, but in practice, it comes with a high insurance premium. Around the strait, barge and boom barriers, smokescreen devices, and close patrol lines have been reinforced to counter surface and underwater threats. The attacks came again. These defenses make it harder to approach, but they don't eliminate the risk. The main effect is to increase the number of guards at the gate and slow down every passage. When you look at the economic side of the map, the word closure actually means loss. When a convoy waits in Kerch, the alternative railway line is not just a line on a map, but a cost curve. Fuel, shifts, spare parts, camouflage, escorts, fatigue. Every hour spent waiting at the dock for fuel transferred to ferries and tankers translates into delays elsewhere in the war. The lanes that open and close with every alarm create an artery that seems to exist and not exist at the same time. At this point, the strategy boils down to this question. Is it cheaper to keep the bridge open or to build a new logistics infrastructure without considering the cost? For a moment, we step onto the bridge. Concrete, steel, and cables. But the war is not about the material, it's about the system. When an underwater explosion raises suspicions about structural integrity, parameters such as hazardous materials, speed, and axle pressure are recalibrated on the railway side. On the road, heavy trucks and fuel tankers are either restricted to specific time windows or redirected entirely to the sea. A bridge that appears open on paper is downgraded to high-risk variable status in planning software. This does not mean you have lost the bridge. It means you have lost predictable capacity. Is ammunition transported according to a schedule or according to tactics? This is precisely where political rhetoric lags behind. Official bulletins quickly circulate the phrase, "Traffic has been reopened," while kilometer-long queues in the summer heat are dismissed as delays. In the language of the commander on the ground, the picture is stark. Turn dangerous cargo back to the ferry, divert military trains to the southern land corridor, and stop and start at every alarm. This is what the British call the security burden. The batteries, radars, and crews deployed to keep a bridge open mean reduced defense at another critical point. Every button that lights up in the control tower means another one goes out on another front. How many batteries are needed to protect a bridge? Let's consider the first 6 hours of a crisis. When the high threat alarm sounds over the strait, heavy vehicle traffic and dangerous cargo come to an immediate halt. Passengers and light vehicles move intermittently at a slow pace. The emergency share from Crimea's internal depots is activated. Ferry terminals become congested, and the tanker schedule is expanded. In the following hours, the southern land corridor increases its role as a substitute. But those routes also mean more surveillance, more escorts, and more stop-and-go traffic. By the 24-hour mark, the flow of ammunition and fuel to the front lines becomes unpredictable. The tactical tempo slows, and fire intensity shifts from hourly plans to daily plans. This scenario is not played out once, but repeatedly with each alarm. A voice of objection will rise. But the bridge is still there. Vehicles are passing. Can't you see? Yes, the bridge is still there in the photo. Yes, civilian traffic continues most days. But the issue is not how many vehicles passed, but what cargo, at what speed, and with what security margin. Restrictions on hazardous cargo, such as fuel and ammunition, the reduction of military trains, the prioritization of passenger-focused traffic. Each of these may seem small individually, but together they paint a larger picture. Functional loss has occurred without destruction. This is not a hit-and-forget strategy. It is a hit-and-slow-down strategy. Returning to the psychology on the ground, the Kerch Bridge was portrayed as one of Putin's personal symbolic projects. Therefore, every alarm is not just a disruption of a route, but also of a narrative. The legitimacy narrative built around the connection between Crimea and the Russian mainland stumbles with every logistical setback. But Moscow is taking countermeasures, expanding the southern land corridor, layering air and sea defenses around Kerch, increasing barge and boom barriers, activating smokescreens more frequently, and managing the passage regime in a dodge-and-avoid manner. Each of these measures transforms the bridge from a static structure into a dynamic security project. And that is precisely where budget, planning, and time begin to be consumed. When we look at the operational results, the picture becomes clearer. As artillery and UAV density increases on the southern front, the railway backbones shift from Crimea to the coastal strip, alters the geometry of resupply. This shortens distances at some points while increasing exposure to fire threats at others. Every disruption in the synchronization between railway transfers and ferry tanker operations means that high-volume fire plans are being pushed back in certain sections of the front. When the hourly rhythm of supply shifts to a daily rhythm, the sound of artillery fire grows fainter. This is why headlines like, "The bridge wasn't destroyed, but it was lost for military purposes," are not alone. While some independent and opposition publications explicitly state this, mainstream news agencies' coverage of current events also paints a similar picture of the actual outcome. Another critical detail is the mindset of decision-makers. The road bridge is constantly in the public eye as part of daily life. One day there is a partial closure, the next day there are queues, the next day there are videos. The public does not see the difference between the bridge is working and the bridge is safe. Meanwhile, the logistics planner increases the risk factor after each alarm cycle. Even if the engineer says controlled passage, the soldier demands predictability. It's not the drop that spills the bucket, it's the rhythm of the drops. And an artery with a disrupted rhythm is considered virtually closed in war. Now let's zoom in. Kerch's fate is tied to the broader supply picture of the Black Sea and Azov routes. As the railway line descending from Rostov to the southern coastal strip assumes the role of a new backbone, the budget allocated for repairs and security is increasing. Backup bridges, temporary pontoons, additional ferry routes, each is technically feasible, but each is strategically costly. Because every ruble invested in one region is missing from another. Every fortification Moscow builds while living with the reality that the bridge is a target at any moment means field evacuation for another front. That is why the UK MOD's diagnosis of security burden is not just a sentence, but a balance sheet line. Of course, there is a counter-narrative. Official agencies are quickly spreading the phrases opened, closed, reopened. Drivers waiting in the summer heat become the visual representation of the message, civilian life continues. However, the pages are closing differently in the soldier's notebook. When military trains become scarce, dangerous cargo classes are rerouted to ferries, and lanes are closed at every alarm. A planner writes, "We won't assume the bridge is passable," instead of, "We'll cross the bridge." The Crimean bridge's current meaning lies precisely in this duality. A symbol for politics, a variable for logistics. And on the front lines, variable means risk. There may not be a single answer to the question, what will happen now? But some facts have become very clear. The Kerch Bridge is still standing, but its function has changed. This massive structure over the Kerch Strait is technically still in use. However, its reliability is seriously in question. Following the major attacks in 2022 and 2023, air threats, UAV and sea drone attacks against the bridge have become a permanent new normal. Today, the bridge is closed to vehicles weighing over 5 tons, and the passage of military convoys is both risky and slow. This makes it a strategic but now high-risk artery in Russia's eyes. In other words, Kerch is standing but logistically paralyzed. The southern land corridor, alternative or new risk? Russia is shifting its focus to the southern land route to reduce its dependence on Kerch. However, this route falls within the range of Ukraine's long-range weapons, including HIMARS, SDB, AASM, and ATACMS. While some sections of the southern corridor are closer to the front lines, reducing the logistics route, the risk of crossing under fire increases. Thus, the alternative Moscow sees as a solution comes with new vulnerabilities. The sea route is expanding, but is dependent on weather conditions and the threat of UAVs. Restrictions on the bridge have placed a new burden on ferry and tanker traffic. Military-civilian transport operations using floating platforms across the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov are increasing day by day. However, these routes are both dependent on weather conditions and vulnerable to UAV attacks. In particular, Ukraine's recent attacks on ports, docks, and moving ships using maritime drones are testing Russia's maritime security capabilities. Even a slowdown in all transportation during a stormy week directly affects troop rotations and ammunition resupply. Engineers and commanders are back on the scene with every alarm. Every time there is an attack on the Kerch Bridge, it is not just missile and drone threats that come into play. Engineers' emergency damage assessment, security experts' traffic diversion protocols, and command-level decision algorithms are also reactivated. The trucks waiting in the field, the slowing buses, and the vehicles nervously turning back onto the bypass road are not just a civilian ordeal, but a strategic indicator. Every delay on the front lines is a window of opportunity for the enemy. When an artillery battery receives its ammunition 2 hours late, an attack is delayed by a day. A defense that was about to collapse is closed. That's why Kerch is not just a bridge today, it's a time machine. Who uses time better is more valuable than concrete. Moreover, the average cost of a Su-30SM fighter jet is approximately $50 million. This figure is not merely the sticker price of an aircraft, it represents the concrete value of Russia's extremely limited resources, engineering capabilities, and time. Producing a fighter jet of this caliber is not just a matter of money, it requires modern electronic avionics, advanced radar systems, engine components, testing infrastructure, and highly skilled labor. However, Russia is currently facing serious bottlenecks in almost all of these areas. Western sanctions have brought the supply of microchips and advanced composite materials to a virtual standstill. The Russian defense industry is forced to turn to secondary parts from China or lower quality alternatives from the domestic market. This is both slowing down the production process and lowering quality. Moreover, the constant spending pressure caused by the war has disrupted budget planning. The Kremlin had increased the defense budget to $150 billion for 2024, but was forced to reduce it to $100 billion for 2025. This decline weakens the ability to establish new production lines and disrupts the maintenance and repair cycles of existing lines. Immediately after the attack, Russia tried to downplay the scale of the incident. However, the fires were clearly visible in satellite data published by NASA's FIRMS system. Leaked civilian videos showed flames reaching nearly to the runway boundaries. The immediate closure of the Kerch Bridge to traffic, along with air defense alerts in Feodosia and Simferopol, highlighted the scale of the panic. Traffic on the Crimean bridge came to a complete standstill. The queue of vehicles stretching toward the Taman Peninsula reached a record density of over 30 kilometers. Drivers were unable to move for hours. According to a statement from the bridge's press service, around 2 a.m., 1,850 vehicles attempting to enter the bridge from the Taman side were in line for manual security checks. The waiting time reached up to 5 hours. At the same time, 349 more vehicles arriving from the Kerch direction were waiting for security checks. The process on this route was faster, taking approximately 1 hour to complete. However, scanner checks took up to 7 hours in some cases. By 4 p.m., the congestion had decreased slightly. The number of vehicles in the queue dropped to 1,400, and the waiting time fell to 4 hours. Nevertheless, traffic flow in the area has almost completely come to a standstill. Authorities have stated that the delays in scanning are due to increased security concerns. In particular, Ukraine's long-range drone attacks in recent days have prompted Russia to tighten manual checks at critical infrastructure points. The Crimean Bridge is one of the places where these measures are most severely felt. The psychological repercussions of this demonstration are the other side of the coin. The latest call by Refat Chubarov, chairman of the Crimean Tatar National Assembly, clearly reveals this psychological breakdown. Chubarov said that civilians who came from Russia and settled in Crimea illegally must leave the peninsula immediately, and he recorded his message in Russian to directly target the occupiers.
Специально записываю обращение на русском языке, чтобы сказанное мною было понятным гражданам России, которые незаконно пребывают на...
In his statement, Chubarov said, "As you have already begun to realize, the Kerch Bridge, which was illegally built to connect occupied Crimea to Russian territory, will soon be destroyed. And you may find yourselves trapped in a kind of pocket," addressing a broad audience, including Russian citizens vacationing in Crimea, and reinforcing his call for withdrawal. We are seeing these calls yield concrete results. In April 2025, the governor of Sevastopol called for the voluntary evacuation of families with children, followed the next week by the return of railway cars from Donetsk, loaded with passengers via Kerch to Krasnodar, and posts on Russian defense blogs stating that officers' families were being relocated to Novorossiysk, raising alarm bells. News reports indicate that many military families are returning to the Russian mainland in secret or in stages. As is well known, after the 2014 annexation, Russia began encouraging tens of thousands of Russian citizens to settle on the peninsula. The aim was to turn Crimea into Russian territory and change the demographic structure in its favor. According to Russia's official 2014 Crimea census results, the total population of the peninsula was reported as 2.28 million. In this census, the Russian population accounted for 67.9%, Ukrainians for 15.7%, and Crimean Tatars for 10.6%. The ethnic Russian population has risen to 1.5 million since 2014 due to migration and the arrival of military personnel and their families. However, with the war in Ukraine, the situation has changed, especially for Russian officers and their families. The families of Russian military personnel stationed in Crimea are concerned that Crimea may be targeted in a Ukrainian counter-offensive. The Ukrainian partisan movement ATACMS made important assessments on this issue. ATACMS reported that almost all of the families of senior personnel of the Black Sea Fleet had left the peninsula. The movement attributes this to an internal directive ordering Russian forces to take higher security measures at military facilities in Crimea. According to a report by German broadcaster Deutsche Welle, citing diplomatic sources, Moscow has introduced a priority quota system for the families of security personnel stationed in Crimea. Initially, around 10,000 people were targeted for relocation to Krasnodar and Stavropol. The partisan network reported that Bar's reserve units were conducting secret patrols in civilian clothing in the bays of Sevastopol, that security measures had been increased, and that equipment was being concealed. Additionally, all leave days for military personnel have been cancelled, according to a statement by an ATESH agent directly linked to air defense systems. Air defense personnel have begun evacuating their families to military camps in the southern military district. This evacuation order can be seen as a sign that the security situation in the region is critical. It is alleged that the Russian administration plans to evacuate approximately 250,000 people in the first phase, including military families, defense industry technicians, railway and port personnel, children, and the elderly. According to an analysis published by Forbes Russia, the Black Sea Fleet headquarters has 30,000 family members, half of whom have already left between May and July 2025. In addition to military personnel, ordinary Russians on the peninsula are also leaving Crimea. Reports indicate that the number of Russian citizens leaving the peninsula has reached 100,000 in recent times. This number is expected to increase further in light of recent developments. The total daily capacity for two-way traffic is 40,000 vehicles, but following the explosions in 2024, traffic on the sole remaining bridge has been reduced by half. The same situation is ongoing today. However, traffic on the peninsula remains gridlocked. The Kerch Bridge is also a risky alternative for those seeking to flee Crimea. This is because the bridge falls within the range of Storm Shadow and ATACMS missiles. Ukraine stated in May 2025 that it is maintaining its strike and retreat capability targeting Kerch. The railway section is still limited by repairs. It has been reduced to 2 trains per hour, or 4,000 passengers. In other words, all exits from the peninsula are about to close. Novorossiysk was considered a route. 50% of the Black Sea Fleet is stationed here. The fleet can carry 1,000 passengers chance landing operations with Repercussion-class landing ships, but a significant portion of the ships have been hit or are under repair. The straits are closed to warships under the Montreux Convention, but civilian ro-ro services are theoretically possible with Turkey's permission. Large passenger flights are unsafe due to the threat of UAVs and cruise missiles. There have been no scheduled flights since the summer of 2024. IL-76 sorties are being used for military strategic transport. Civilian ship passage in the Black Sea is free under the Montreux Convention, but Turkey invoked Article 19 3 days after the start of the war in March 2022, restricting the straits to the warring parties. Therefore, Russian naval assets cannot enter the area. However, Russian civilian ferries can transit from the Caucasus coast to the waters off Odessa without stopping. Turkey does not provide military escort to evacuation ships caught in the actual conflict, but can provide a pre-authorized corridor through the straits for humanitarian convoys flying the SAF-EAID/ICRC flag. Considering all this information, the evacuation of all Russians in Crimea appears to be quite challenging. In conclusion, Ukraine's latest drone attack not only eliminated a military target, but also once again declared to the world that the nature of war has changed. In the battlefield, it is no longer expensive technology that prevails, but accessible intelligence. Drones costing a few $1,000s are rendering jets, radar facilities, and ammunition depots worth millions of dollars useless in a matter of seconds. This was more than just an attack. This was asymmetric warfare itself. Ukraine is now openly challenging Russia's military infrastructure, built over decades and costing billions of dollars, with a drone worth a few months' salary. These UAVs, which cost less than a family car, can take out an entire airbase. Russia's high-tech platforms like the Su-30SM were designed for modern air combat, but when parked, they are as defenseless as a bird. This is where Ukraine's advantage lies. This is not a land grab. The issue now is doctrine, superiority, and who will define the logic of future warfare. Every jet shot down is not just a combat vehicle. It is a blow to the Kremlin's belief that it is superior in war. Every depot that burns is not just a loss of ammunition, it is a crack in the invulnerability armor that Putin's regime has presented to the public. And this is not only on the front lines, it is also creating chaos in the subconscious of the Russian people. For civilians living in semi-isolated but strategically important regions like Crimea, these attacks mean that areas once considered safe are now targets. Ukraine is no longer a passive defender, it is an active and planned threat. This new strategy, which achieves greater impact at lower cost, proves that war is won not just with weapons, but with time, resources, and psychology. At this point, Kiev has struck not only a Su-30SM, but also Russia's perception of superiority in the war. The outcome is clear. Ukraine is determined. Its strategy is sharp, and the message is clear. Crimea is Ukraine. No trains, no fuel, no war. This is the brutal logic behind Ukraine's latest attack on Russian-occupied territory. Ukrainian commandos targeted a Russian fuel convoy near the Djangoi train station in Crimea. Djangoi is no ordinary target. This strategic railway line, located at the northern entrance to Crimea, connects Russian troops in Kherson to supply routes across the entire peninsula. Fuel convoys passing through this hub power tanks, trucks, and warplanes on the southern front. So why could Kiev's pinpoint strikes on railway lines disrupt Putin's southern front? On August 21st, Ukrainian commandos targeted a set of wagons carrying fuel and lubricants near the Djangoi railway station. The attack lit up the night sky with a fireball. The Kiev Special Operations Forces confirmed the operation within hours. According to statements, a Russian train carrying fuel and lubricants was ambushed while moving through northern Crimea. The Special Operations Forces concluded their statement with 3 words: always beyond the border. Russian lines face disruptions in both military and civilian operations at the same time. This scenario indicates a breakdown that directly affects the fuel supply rhythm of the southern front. The results of the strike deep strategy were clearly visible here. The move in Djangoi targeted not just a train but an entire network. Djangoi is the junction where the flow entering the peninsula via the Kerch Bridge turns towards southern Ukraine on the railway. From this junction, connections extend north to Melitopol, east to Mariupol, east to Tokmak on the internal lines, and northeast to Zaporizhia. This junction has played a decisive role in the Russian military's fuel, ammunition, and spare parts shipments for years. Materials transported via the land corridor primarily loaded onto these tracks. Ukraine has therefore targeted fuel trains, transformer stations, and the areas around the station. When the most critical connecting point in Crimea is struck, the daily supply plan for the southern front must be rewritten from scratch. When the rail supply is cut off, trucks and fuel tankers are loaded. When the road network cannot handle the same volume in terms of range and speed, the frontline pace slows down. As Djangoi's hub role weakens, routes via Mariupol and Melitopol become less frequent. This is why pressure on a single station affects the entire line. The nature of the target indicates that the choice was made deliberately. Fuel trains are the lifelines determining the mobility of frontline vehicles. The simultaneous outage of dozens of tanker cars is a severe blow not only to stockpiles, but also to the distribution schedule. Even the duration of track repairs is recorded as a delay in the shipment rhythm. As repairs prolong, diversion routes become mandatory. When diversion routes become visible, new attack windows emerge. The operation was combined with simultaneous pressure on surveillance and communication disruptions around the station. Therefore, it produced not a single incident, but a connected move effect. Meanwhile, infrastructure at different locations was also targeted during the same time frame. The refinery section in Rostov and the GRU facility in Sevastopol were hit. This trio aims to disrupt the flow of fuel from the depot to the front line, both through the pipeline and over the tracks. When the refinery is hit, the production and distribution equation is disrupted. When the transformer and substation are hit, the traction of heavy trains and the energy continuity of stations are cut off. When intelligence and command facilities are pressured, re-establishing lines and planning on the ground are delayed. The damage caused in 3 rings overnight multiplied the burden on defense elements. A conflict arose over the allocation of resources between facility security and line repairs. Russian authorities restricted internet and mobile communications under the pretext of security, thereby limiting the flow of information. All of this turned the Djangoi-focused operation into a network attack. Announcements of indefinite interruptions for mobile internet in Crimea came one after another. The Sevastopol administration and the so-called Information Ministry of the Peninsula issued warnings of prolonged blackouts for security reasons. Such measures affect both tactical communication on the ground and civilian movement. Long outages directly cause disruptions in card payments and ATM transactions. Cash shortages also strain fuel and food supply chains. The public perceives the impact of logistical pressures on daily life in this way. This demonstrates how the collateral effects of a military operation on civilian life can escalate. As blackouts persist, information gaps fuel speculation. Speculation can fuel waves of shopping panic in supply chains. Therefore, internet outages in Crimea are now more than just a security tool. They are an economic factor. The spread of card and ATM issues across Crimea has made the financial impact of mobile network restrictions visible. Delays and interruptions in payment systems have reached supermarket cash registers. Complaints have increased about people having to travel outside the city to find cash throughout the week. This outage has also slowed payment traffic at gas stations. The overlap of outages with logistics has led to irregularities in fuel supply. Headlines about the lack of AI-95 have dominated the news on the peninsula. Official statements describe the issue as temporary and logistical. However, as pressure on rail and transformer lines persists, the risk of temporary outages becoming chronic increases. Civilian complaints reflect the social repercussions of pressure targeting military objectives. This repercussion weakens the perception of impunity in Crimea. The disruptions in fuel supply are not unique to the peninsula. There are also signs of this across Russia. In recent months, refinery attacks and railway disruptions have pushed wholesale gasoline prices to record highs. Even export restrictions and subsidies have failed to alleviate the sense of scarcity in some regions. The difficulties are becoming more visible in remote areas and Crimea. This picture explains the burden that hitting deep is placing on Moscow's domestic market. As pressure on the railways increases, traffic is shifting to roads. As traffic shifts to roads, unit costs and delays increase. As delays increase, military prioritization squeezes the civilian market. The squeeze on the civilian market, in turn, feeds back as price hikes and queues. The result is the same crisis manifesting itself in both military and economic terms. Claims that lines in the Zaporizhia region were closed ahead of the night in Djangoi also surfaced. It was reported that a fuel train was destroyed between Urozhain and Tokmak, rendering the tracks unusable. Photos and notes from the field revealed the need for repairs to the line. Even nighttime transport in the region could not escape sensor and drone surveillance. A single disruption on the tracks can trigger a domino effect in logistics plans. When one region is taken out of commission, cargo is redirected to other lines. The cost and duration of rerouting reduce the fuel supply rhythm to the front lines. Pressure on the Crimea and Zaporizhia lines during the same week disrupted fuel balance in the southern front. This simultaneity aligns with a planned network pressure profile. Therefore, viewing the Djangoi incident as an isolated action would be incomplete. Now, let us address the main question. With this level of pressure on the railway artery flowing from Crimea to the south, what alternatives can the Russian army turn to? The first option is to focus on the bridge and road network. This choice increases the number of tanker convoys and fuel trucks. However, convoys mean low speed, visible routes, and increased risk. The second option is to prioritize maritime resupply along the Azov coast. However, maritime drones and coastal surveillance make this route costly as well. The third option is to activate railway bypasses from further north and accelerate repairs. This requires heavy equipment, energy supply, and secure working windows. The strained network cannot sustain this daily. Targeting fuel trains indirectly but effectively reduces the operational tempo of the Russian southern group. The daily consumption of armored units, truck routes capacity, and airbase resupply rhythms all draw from the same source. Disruptions to this source force commanders into risky cost-cutting measures. These savings manifest themselves in reduced maneuverability and sortie rates. Once reductions begin, the initiative shifts in favor of defense. The battlefield reflects this shift through increased drone attacks and reduced artillery fire. Fuel shortages even increase the cost of holding positions. Simple but critical details such as heating, generators, and supply circulation break down. Each breakdown paves the way for the next attack window. To break this chain, the logistics network must be safely re-established. The panic signals coming from within Crimea are also part of this equation. The Ukrainian side's approach is clear and consistent with the data. While deep strikes may appear to target refineries, transformers, railways, and fuel trains at separate points, they all strike the same flow. Each unit hit is a link in the depot line station train convoy chain. The cumulative effect of these links is measured in fuel hours at the front. When hours begin to be delayed, the task cycle of units lengthens. When the task cycle lengthens, the opportunity for surprise and pressure decreases. Decreased pressure creates space for the defense to regroup. For this reason, the outcome of the night in Djangoi is not merely a statistic. It is a cost item written for the next week on the southern front. This cost item produces a multiplier effect each time it is repeated. The Russian side's countermeasures can be summarized under a limited heading. Intensifying air defense around the station and along the line will be the first reflex. However, air defense always has vulnerabilities at low altitudes and short ranges due to drone saturation. Electronic warfare can be effective at the station and on approach routes. However, jamming and scrambling also disrupt their own command and control flows. Heavy equipment and labor are required to accelerate rail repairs. The safe operation of these requires another layer of security. Shifting focus to roads creates new target clusters. The option of resupply from the sea introduces new risks along the coast. In short, every step in defense creates a new vulnerability. The pressure on Djangoi and its surroundings has caused a shift in the agenda across the entire peninsula from operational efficiency to security. The priority has shifted from planned flow to emergency repairs and protection. This shift inevitably slows down the regular flow of shipments. The slowed-down flow pushes frontline commanders to revise their daily objectives. Revisions make attack and defense plans more cautious. Caution leaves the initiative with the defending side. This is precisely the outcome Ukraine is anticipating in the southern sector. When fuel shortages and transportation disruptions converge, windows of opportunity for attacks multiply. These windows are filled with drone, artillery, and special forces operations. Therefore, Djangoi is merely the beginning. Secondary indicators on the ground confirm this framework. Public authorities have cited temporary and technical reasons. However, successive attacks render technical justifications insufficient. Repeated disruptions call into question planning capabilities. When planning is perceived as weak, defense morale is affected. This decline in morale eventually impacts performance on the front lines. Once the reflection begins, it is more difficult to reverse. The spread of claims that the railway in the Zaporizhia area is completely closed is also affecting perceptions on the network. The term complete closure is technically dependent on repair and bypass times. However, such headlines increase the risk premium for everyone using the supply chain. As the risk premium grows, carriers even replan night movements. As plans change, shipment volumes decrease. As volumes decrease, the pressure for frontline priority increases. After the night in Crimea, we will hear the same question from different fronts: railway, transformer, warehouse, or refueling train. The answer lies not in the target, but in the flow. Every day the flow is disrupted, plans at the front are revised. As plans are revised, the margin of error grows. As the margin of error grows, new windows open. These windows are filled by the fastest drones and the most prepared units. The prepared side maintains the pressure. As a result, Djangoi has become a threshold testing Crimea's claim to connectivity. The targeting of fuel trains, the suppression of refinery and transformer lines, and mobile network blackouts have combined to form a network pressure. This pressure has disrupted fuel flows to the southern front. The disruption necessitated a shift to road and sea resupply. This shift created new target clusters. The new clusters offered new opportunities for low-cost drones. Payment and fuel issues observed in Crimea's civilian operations mirrored the military pressure. As the mirror grew, the perception of security weakened. The weakened perception made station and line repairs more fragile. This cycle shows why Ukraine's depth strategy produced results. Looking ahead, there are three clear headings. First, even if communication and payment disruptions within Crimea are resolved in the short term, they will return as long as network pressure persists. Second, the safe windows for railway bypasses and repairs shrink with each attack. Third, as the southern front's fuel tempo becomes dependent on convoys and sea resupply, target visibility increases. When these 3 points come together, operational initiative shifts toward the defending side. For Ukraine, the issue is not a single shot, but sustainability. Sustainability is achieved through low-cost but regular repetition. Regular repetition shortens the impact of repairs. A shorter impact amplifies strategic pressure. This is the full picture. Crimea is no longer just a geographical area. It has become a supply equation. The unknown in this equation is no longer distance, but continuity. Ukraine has solved the distance problem with low-cost platforms. Now it is in the phase of making the network unsustainable through continuity. This phase makes the repair-maintenance trade-off more expensive. The more expensive trade-off imposes a delayed but permanent burden on frontline performance. Once this permanent burden is established, reversing it takes a long time. Long time is a luxury in war plans. The side without this luxury narrows its strategy. The on-the-ground manifestation of a narrowed strategy is the loss of initiative. If this network pressure continues at the same pace for a few more weeks, how will the daily rhythm of the southern front change? If part of the line is repaired but targeted again the same night, does the repair retain its meaning? How much longer can road and sea supply routes bear the cost of visibility? How will communication and payment disruptions within Crimea affect societal behavior? In your opinion, where will the perception of untouchability break down as key nodes like Djangoi remain under pressure? How much delay will there be in the frontline results, and how will this delay disrupt planning? These questions will find answers in the coming days alongside new developments. As answers emerge, we will gain a clearer picture of which links in the network are more fragile. As we see more, the strategic choice between continuity or intensity will come to the fore. Let's expand the discussion with your perspectives in the comments. Your participation directly enhances the quality of the content. Thank you for watching.
петух, нахуй.
Ебанет, не ебанет? Ебанет.
Ukraine unleashed a hellish symphony upon Russia this time. Moscow is engulfed in catastrophic flames. Targets were struck one after another along a broad front stretching from the oil depots in Smolensk to Moscow and Leningrad, and from Belgorod and Kursk to the infrastructure in Donbass. Now, as Russia burns on all sides, the people have lost their patience. Anger and panic have taken to the streets, because on September 11th, swarms of drones darkened the sky, and even underground shelters were no longer safe. Claims that new-generation Flamingo long-range cruise missiles were used in this wave of attacks plunged millions of Russians in Moscow and its surroundings into deep anxiety. There is no official confirmation of the use of Flamingo missiles yet. However, the accuracy, strike power, and successive explosions suggest that munitions beyond the ordinary were deployed. The Ukrainian-made Flamingo missile, with its 1,150-kilogram warhead and 3,000-kilometer range, particularly fuels this concern. When we delve into the details, you will understand why the Russians are right to be nervous. More than 220 Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicles staged a veritable show of force. The first flames rose in the darkness of night, exploding in the Smolensk countryside. The target was the fully operational Lukoil oil depot in the Kardimovo settlement, which had previously been set ablaze by Ukrainian UAVs. Last year, only 2 of the 16 tanks here survived the fire. Now, the unfinished wreckage has become a target once again. Footage circulating on social media shows the drone, locked onto its target along a programmed route, approaching the terminal and crashing directly into it. In the audio accompanying the footage, off-camera commentators can be heard confirming that the target belonged to the Lukoil facility. The latest attack also engulfed the 9 storage tanks that were still standing. All of them were reduced to ashes once again in the resulting fire. At the same time, alarms were also sounding in Penza. A series of explosions occurred in the regional natural gas pipeline connected to the primary oil pipeline surrounding the city. According to local sources, these explosions were not coincidental. They were directly linked to military shipments and facility activity. The nerve centers of the energy infrastructure were targeted. Far to the northwest, the port of Primorsk, known as Russia's energy gateway to Europe, was also caught up in the wave of attacks. This giant terminal in the Leningrad Oblast is the largest export point for crude oil shipped across the Baltic Sea. That night, drones spotted in the skies over Primorsk engulfed a ship in the port in flames. At the same time, a fire at one of the pumping stations halted operations for hours. The intensity of the fire and the height of the smoke created a state of emergency around the port. And while all this was happening, the capital, Moscow, was not spared either. The Naro-Fominsk region, located approximately 70 kilometers southwest of Moscow, echoed with intense air defense activities during the night. According to Russian sources, numerous anti-aircraft systems were activated in the airspace above the region. Local residents reported hearing successive explosions in the sky and seeing flashes that turned night into day in some places. It is clear that this region is not a random target. Since the Soviet era, Naro-Fominsk has been considered one of Russia's most symbolic and prestigious settlements for its land forces. The 4th Guards Kantemirovskaya tank division stationed here is a showcase unit among the Russian Army's armored forces. This division, which has high representational power both in Kremlin ceremonies and on the battlefield, also played important roles in the war in Ukraine. However, it is not yet clear whether the target was directly this military base when the air defense systems were activated. Some military observers suggest that unmanned aerial vehicles pose a general threat around Moscow, and that the target may not only be the Kantemirovskaya base, but also radar systems or military command centers in the area. It should also be noted that the Naro-Fominsk region is home not only to tank units, but also to various electronic warfare elements, supply units, and command and control infrastructure. Therefore, the possibility of an attack could be part of a broader operation aimed at disrupting Russia's rear preparations. Such operations also have a social and psychological dimension. Exploding pipelines, burning oil depots, and unusable logistics terminals crippled the fuel system. The succession of these attacks bears the hallmarks of a disruption strategy aimed at economic breathing space, rather than a frontline offensive. The Russian government was forced to restrict gasoline exports at the end of July. However, this restriction was not a solution, but merely a temporary curtain to save face. Behind the curtain, a deepening crisis was growing. Domestically, prices on the A95 line have increased by nearly 50% since the beginning of the year. Sales were curtailed at some stations, while others closed their shutters due to a lack of fuel. Moreover, this crisis is affecting not only individuals, but also agriculture and industry. In southern Russia, combine harvesters in the fields cannot start. There is no diesel. Trucks cannot transport grain loads. Wheat ears bend in the wind, but there is no one to harvest them. Grain is left in the fields to rot. Russia's food weapon is now just a memory. Industry is feeling the same pain. Steel factories are halting production, chemical plants are operating at reduced capacity, truck fleets are falling silent. Thousands of workers in small towns are being forced to take leave. When the production chain stops, it's not just the machines that stop, but families too. From the capital Moscow to St. Petersburg, from Kursk to Kazan, every city wakes up wondering where the next attack will come from. Will it fall on our neighborhood tonight? Is now the most real inner voice echoing in Moscow's apartment buildings. Housing ads are quietly being taken down. No one is investing in land under the threat of war anymore. Hotels are empty, concerts are cancelled, theatres are closing their curtains. Schools are closing every few days due to alarms. The voice of cultural life has given way to sirens and panic-filled announcements. A quiet but profound change is taking place in Russia's major cities. The face of cities is shaped not only by concrete, but also by people. And today, centers like Moscow, Yekaterinburg, and Kazan are trying to fill the void left by a vanishing social class with a new crowd. The country's educated, creative, mobile middle class, engineers, academics, IT specialists, and cultural sector workers are leaving one after another. Some have already left, others are still trying to pack their bags. The void left behind by those who have departed is being filled by a new class, those who profit from the war. Those enriched by defense industry contracts, bureaucrats appointed in occupied territories, and the newly wealthy rising through private military companies, all are settling in city centers. They are buying homes at high prices, gradually changing the urban population map. On paper, Russia's real estate market appears. This task is no longer carried out with a high-profile announcement from Moscow, but through unofficial quotas distributed to regional governors, factory managers, and local bureaucrats. Every city, every factory, every school is given a number, and to reach that number, persuasion, pressure, threats, or outright bribery come into play. The targets include debtors, undocumented migrant workers, young people who have come to the attention of social services due to family problems, the homeless, and those who are too desperate to resist. In other words, the system targets its weakest links. Some are forced to enlist by their families, others volunteer to escape debt, clear their records, or secure social assistance for their children. But this notion of volunteering increasingly turns into irony, because those who return do so having lost not only their bodies but also their souls. Post-traumatic stress disorder, constant alertness, anger outbursts, and the normalization of violence by war drag those who return not to their homes, but to another hell they are forced to carry within themselves. At the same time, another collapse is taking place within Russia's internal structure, a labor crisis. As migration accelerates and the local population is sent to war, a serious shortage is emerging, particularly in sectors such as agriculture, logistics, and construction. Migrants from Central Asia are stepping in to fill this gap. However, they too are both part of and victims of this system. On the one hand, civilian administrators welcome this labor force, because the wheels must keep turning. On the other hand, security forces label migrants as an internal threat, accusing them of terrorism, smuggling, and even economic sabotage. From Moscow to Novosibirsk, from Samara to Vladivostok, routine raids, waves of deportations targeting undocumented migrants, and humiliating checks have become widespread again. In some places, migrants who go to work in the morning are dropped off at the border gate in the evening. This dual pressure mechanism triggers xenophobia among the local population and threatens the sustainability of migrant labor. This system is not a reflection of a living society. It is a system that consumes its people in order to sustain the financing of war. Food inflation has exceeded 10.79%. But this is not just a statistic. It is the name of a daily struggle for survival. Food is no longer a necessity in Russia, but a luxury. Bread, milk, eggs, oil, even the most basic products are now only available at their sticker price for retired workers, single-income families, and low-wage earners. The price of a kilo of potatoes has tripled compared to a year ago. Meat, cheese, yogurt, they are either absent from the shelves or merely a dream to look at and pass by. Even the simplest dish on the table is now unattainable. Weekly fluctuations in products like eggs and vegetables wipe out even the tiny relief a poor family might have found at the beginning of the month within a few days. Inflation may have fallen below 5%, but only for this reason. No one can afford to buy anything other than bread or a candle. And the central bank? It keeps interest rates between 18% and 21%. This is not economic management. It is a form of medieval torture. Even Sberbank, the pride of the state, has been forced to silence its rosy lies. Even Russia's largest public bank has admitted that the economy is sliding into stagnation and that a recession is inevitable if interest rates remain at this level. In short, this is no longer just a war. It is the slow collapse of a system, a society, even a dream of the future. While Ukraine rains fire from the sky, the machine built by the Kremlin loses a cog with every blow. The attacks target not only facilities, but also trust, stability, and the sense of belonging. On one side, refineries reduced to ashes, logistics networks buried in rubble. On the other, displaced households, emptying cities, darkened shop windows. As Russia sends its tanks to the front, it is breeding hunger, fear, and despair in its wake. This war is no longer called a special operation. It is the death knell. Ukraine is tracking Russia's navy everywhere. The Black Sea region is one of the areas where tracking is most intense. Russian navy ships are searching for holes to escape from Ukrainian intelligence across the vast Black Sea. However, even Novorossiysk is no longer a rear base. The Russian Black Sea fleet thought it would be able to relax after leaving Sevastopol and heading east. However, the Ukrainian Defense Intelligence Agency's plan went much further. Special forces affiliated with the Ukrainian Defense Ministry's main directorate attacked a ship belonging to the Russian fleet's MPSV-07 multi-purpose ship project in the Black Sea on September 10th. Commissioned in 2015, with a unit cost of approximately $60 million, and known to have only 4 in inventory, this rare multi-purpose ship of the MPSV-07 class was hit by a precision strike off Novorossiysk. Signs on the ground indicate that the chain that hit the ship was established by both naval UAVs and aerial UAVs. Therefore, Ukrainian intelligence may have employed a dual-pronged attack model at this point. While the airborne component employed electronic warfare jamming and decoys to distract radar attention, the surface-based unmanned high-speed platforms reportedly exploited their low radar cross-section and sea conditions to enter the target range. This tactic sabotaged the barriers at the mouth of Sevastopol, the straight-mouth nets, and the guard schedule throughout 2024. The difference in the sinking of this ship is that this time it was carried all the way to the Novorossiysk gate, considered the rear base. The timing window of the operation was also deliberate. The hours when patrol routes between ports were repeated and shift changes occurred were chosen. With the low noise and high surprise balance maintained under the target, the Pantsir and equivalent short-range air defense layers were too late. Even if there was an intervention, the USV's mass momentum and the warhead it carried were enough to cause system failure with a single hit. This ship, targeted by Ukrainian defense intelligence, was not just a piece of steel. It carried electronic warfare and electronic intelligence payloads. In other words, that hull was the eyes and ears of Russia's Black Sea fleet. With the ship's destruction, Russia's screen went dark instantly, and the fairy tale of a safe harbor was shattered. This frame is read as a blackout in the Black Sea. Because sometimes, in a navy, what is more destructive than sinking is preventing it from seeing and hearing. That is exactly what happened. When we delve deeper into the basic characteristics of the ship, we understand the essence of the matter better. On paper, the MPS V07 class appears to be a search and rescue and multi-purpose mission ship. But with the sensors and EW packages connected to the network, it is a valuable node feeding the maritime picture. For this reason, their numbers are kept low, their maintenance requires meticulous care, and their crew is highly trained. Having only 4 ships in inventory makes each one a separate insurance policy. The configuration introduced in 2015 raises the class's value to around $60 million due to expensive electronics and mission systems. It appears that Ukraine is targeting precisely this cost-effectiveness breaking point. Instead of directly sinking a frigate, cutting the sensor backbone that protects, directs, and feeds that frigate produces more panic at a lower cost. This is what happened off Novorossiysk. Signs of fire and system failure on the ship, followed immediately by the intervention of tugboats, left us with a clear picture. This picture took the Russian fleet out of action, at least for a while. Then there is the shipyard issue for repairing the ship that was hit after the operation. Repairing the hull is relatively easy, but procuring the mission electronics and sensor package is difficult under sanctions. The microelectronics and RF component chain is as sensitive as the sea route. Every node that is taken out of service means a supply puzzle. That is why it would be correct to use the word rare. There is no backup for what is rare, nor is there an equivalent. Russia will have to put such platforms back into service, even if they are worn out. This means permanent sensitivity. Sensitivity is an invitation for swarms. After this ship was hit, Russia has already issued an invitation to Ukraine to carry out more operations of this kind. So, in the coming period, we may witness more Russian ships being targeted in the Black Sea. So, is there a safe harbor left for the Russian Navy to take refuge in? The doctrine that says the East is safe when withdrawn from Sevastopol finds no basis in the age of unmanned swarms. Novorossiysk's land defense may be stronger, but the weakest link at sea is the harbor entrance and the nearby patrol node. Ukraine tested this earlier around Kerch. It paired naval drones with long-range FPV and reconnaissance UAVs to open corridors. The same approach worked in the latest attack. That's why the fairy tale of a safe harbor for the Russian Navy is over. Ukraine managed to build this system in the Black Sea without even using warships. This was not a single flash in the pan, but a series. In other words, Ukraine's pressure system in the Black Sea. Recall that on August 30th, the support tugboat Buk 2190 was hit in a night raid in Sevastopol Bay. This incident served as a prime example of the effect we mentioned. In fact, 2 Mi-8 helicopters were grounded in the same wave. A speedboat and a coastal surveillance radar in western Crimea were silenced on the same night. Also, remember the night attacks around the Project 22,160 patrol ship Sergei Kotov. The screens lit up one by one on the Kerch line, and then the port entrance protection was jammed for days. When the Olenogorsky Gornyak landing ship was hit, the EU and insurance markets raised the risk factor in the Black Sea to the upper limit. When the Kilo-class submarine Rostov-na-Donu was severely damaged in the dry dock attack in Sevastopol, the term attrition became a concrete reality for the Navy. Since then, it has not been necessary to crush the Navy directly in combat. It is enough to disrupt its port rhythm, maintenance schedule, and insurance premiums. The Novorossiysk case is a new link in this chain. The serial loss of fast patrol platforms along the coast has thinned the link that the Russian side calls the peripheral eye. If you've noticed, in Ukraine's attacks in the Black Sea, the Russian Navy first loses its eyes, then its ears. When the radar and EH nodes are disabled, the boats on the coast become vulnerable to being hunted down one by one. 3 strikes in different locations in one night, 2 strikes on another line the next night. This rhythm is forcing Russia's Black Sea fleet into the harbor. When the harbor is full, the only goal is to start the multiple defense paradox. Multiple defenses produce multiple mistakes. Multiple mistakes open a window to the next wave. That is exactly what the last attack did. For years, some dismissed the claim that Ukraine had established naval dominance in the Black Sea without even deploying a single warship as exaggeration. We can now say this represents a conceptual shift. Maritime UAVs like the Magura V5, FPV swarms, kamikaze naval platforms, and reconnaissance/mapping UAVs together form a new force. This force does not merely supplement expensive guided munitions. In some missions, it completely replaces them. A low-cost USV, combined with nighttime sea conditions, disrupts the classic radar and optical surveillance system. Moreover, its life cycle cost is lower than the annual fuel and maintenance cost of a frigate. We see every swarm wave, not every hit. Against all this, Russia's methods of protection against Ukraine's attacks in the Black Sea are ineffective. Nets pulled at the mouth of the strait, buoys, minefields, IR/acoustic sensors. It is believed that all these layers serve a slowing function, but none can achieve a stopping function on their own. Because to completely distinguish a low-profile, composite-coated, low-noise USV at sea, in addition to sensors, time, training, and the right engagement window are required. When the swarm arrives, the window closes. Low-cost FPVs on the air side engage straight-mouth defense with simultaneous saturation, while the real load approaches from below the waterline. Systems like Pantsir may be effective in single strikes, but tire in multi-axis, multi-target assaults. Novorossiysk is learning the same lesson today, and this lesson imposes more expensive watchkeeping on expensive hulls. Meanwhile, in the Black Sea, Ukraine's unilateral corridor initiative since late 2023 has effectively pierced Russia's blockade claim. Civilian ships planned routes and made departures and arrivals. The insurance market initially panicked, then created an adjusted risk premium. Two things lay behind this. One was the increased risk of the Russian fleet leaving port. The other was the fatigue of coastal sensors. The Novorossiysk incident is reinforcing these two grounds. For the fleet to say it is present, it will need more fuel, more escorts, and to take more risks. This encourages a set of behaviors close to saying it is absent. We call this denial at sea and attrition on shore. The result is a real outcome in Kiev's favor. The following detail emerges in the Ukrainian Defense Intelligence's attack campaign in the Black Sea. The target bank is not just the hull, but the nodes that see the hull. Coastal external radars, mobile EH points, command and control cabins, and ELINT platforms roaming the sea. When these nodes are disabled one by one, blind spots form along the coast. A blind spot is a nightmare for any sailor, because you don't know where an unknown wave will come from. You double the watch schedule. When the watch is doubled, people make mistakes, and as they make mistakes, the next wave finds an easier path. The Novorossiysk strike moved this blind spot to the distant shore. Its psychological impact is even greater than its engineering impact. So, does Russia's navy have a chance to recover from this impact and renew itself? Due to the Straits regime, Russia cannot introduce new large warships into the Black Sea during the war. It has to make do with what it has. This means that the fleet is a non-renewable asset. A non-renewable asset is a daily target for cheap fleets. A platform that is disturbed every day protects itself by not going out to sea after a while. A platform that protects itself loses its strategic function. The Navy in the Black Sea is currently read through this equation. There are no new frigates or submarines. The existing ones are either in the repair queue or shuttling within the port. This makes Kiev's doctrine bolder. With the latest picture emerging, Russia is facing an incredible blackout in the Black Sea. Blackout at sea always brings the bridge to mind. The Kerch Bridge is the nerve center of logistics. As the eyes and ears on the coast tire, the bridge and the facilities at its base become more exposed targets. The ammunition food lines running through Azov are already sensitive. Now, when even a rear base is unreliable, protecting the bridge becomes a more costly game. A multi-pronged attack is expected here. That is, simultaneous pressure on the coastal EW node from USVS at sea, FPVS in the air, and cruisers. One must not overlook the heavy pressure on the bridge one day and on logistics every day. This rhythm will break the enemy's morale. A force with broken morale is nervous even behind the strongest armor. A nervous navy cannot manage civilian traffic along the coastline. This gives Ukraine superiority in the maritime domain. There is currently no data to convince those who say Russia will withdraw from the sea and attack from the air. Tactical profiles for penetrating beneath the S-300/400 layers along the coast are complex. Ukraine's long-range SAMS and mobile camouflaged batteries, especially in the west, are narrowing the window. Moreover, the ATACMS and GMLRS family, which are striking units on the ground, are also keeping air bases and fuel depots under rhythmic pressure. Being blind at sea comes at a higher cost than being blind in the air. Aviation does not close the gap at sea. At best, it is an expensive patch. Therefore, the fleet's hope of compensating with air power seems weak. The more it tries to compensate, the faster the attrition accelerates. And as it accelerates, the scenes we see today may repeat tomorrow. The consequences of a new shock that could repeat would be severe. The defeat in the Black Sea has powerful effects not only on the Russian Navy, but also on Putin and the command structure. The image of a fleet fleeing to different ports weighs heavily on the political center. As the chain of command oscillates between strict avoidance and risky patrols, the initiative of the commander in the field is dulled. Then improvise solutions that force civilian military platforms to see the same picture multiply. The deployment of rare hulls like the MPSV-07 to patrol roles is a sign of this. This situation is understood as the tactical routine of strategic exhaustion, because when the fleet loses its primary function, you try to generate primary tasks from secondary platforms. This is always an expensive mistake. This is exactly what happened in Novorossiysk. After the last offensive operation, we can now clearly say that the Black Sea Fleet contributed much less to the war in Ukraine than initially thought. Items such as amphibious pressure, port blockade, and deep water patrol existed on paper. In the field, it turned into a model of avoiding risk in nearby ports. Although missile strikes from the sea continue, this is no longer part of the Navy's function. It is more like an extension of a fixed battery on land. The sea is not at the disposal of the Navy. The Navy is confined to the limits of the sea. The Novorossiysk shock is the embodiment of this confinement. Today, the statement that Putin cannot manage the Navy is not mere agitation, but a visible outcome. A command that cannot manage chains its existence to the port. A Navy chained to the port loses the sea. We must also consider what the Russian side can do from now on. They will try to increase EW intensity and disrupt USV links. They will pull the inner layers of the port further in and build inner barriers in the inner bay. They will mobilize the coastal surveillance network and rely on hit-and-run radars. They will also increase airstrikes and try to burn the drone route at the port entrance. All of this may make some nights calmer on the ground, but it does not change the strategy, because low-cost persistence will eventually wear down the expensive layers. And in the worn-down layer, the weakest link is the human element. In this game, time is now working in Ukraine's favor. Let's summarize the latest picture. The rulebook has changed in the Black Sea. The cheapest platform threatens the most expensive asset every night. This is now called an accounting war, because whichever side keeps writing in the ledger longer is the one that leaves the table. The $60 million MPSV-07 class ship, built in 2015, and of which only 4 examples exist in inventory, struck in Novorossiysk, was written into the most critical line of that ledger. The following note was added below that line: no rear base. After Sevastopol, Novorossiysk is no longer safe either. When the fleet's eyes close, the Navy's hand trembles. A trembling Navy does not leave port. A Navy that does not leave port leaves the sea to others. This is exactly what we are seeing today. Thank you for watching. Moscow. A colossal city with over 13 million inhabitants, bathed in light even at night, boasting one of the world's largest metro systems. Once a capital where you could get lost in the crowd, where life danced even in the alleys. Young people played guitar on Arbat Street, clinking vodka glasses in cafes. The popular Russian drink Stolichnaya cost 600 rubles. A loaf of bread cost 30. A liter of milk cost 70 rubles. Street vendors, theater queues, concert posters, young people skateboarding in Gorky Park, and civil servants rushing to catch the subway in the evening shared the same rhythm. Security was not a concern, but part of everyday life. People walked home late at night, finding the capital full of life. That life is gone now. Now sirens have replaced people's laughter. Airports have turned into battlefields. The panic rising in the shadow of the Kremlin is now everyday life itself. Because this war is no longer just in Donetsk. Ukraine has brought the heat of the conflict to the heart of Moscow. From Belgorod to Kursk, mornings in the neighborhoods surrounding the capital now begin with the sound of sirens. The Russian people, who once watched news of the war across the border on television, now watch their own cities being bombed on the same screens. Flights at Domodedovo and Vnukovo airports have been suspended repeatedly due to drone attacks. Metro signals are cut off. Neighborhoods are blacked out. GPS systems go haywire. The number of drones shot down in Moscow skies during the summer exceeded 100. People who once enjoyed ice cream on Tverskaya Boulevard on summer evenings now fear approaching windows at night. Generators are being discussed in homes, and children are trying to get used to sudden power outages. This means that a war is striking not a distant country, but the very heart of the home. The harshest face of this rupture was seen in mid-March. On the night of March 11th, 2025, streetlights flickered, air defense systems lit up the night sky, and emergency alerts echoed through the city. That night went down in Russian history as the longest air raid siren in the capital. The attack came not from one direction, but from all sides. Layered defense systems had to engage multiple targets simultaneously. This was more than a military blow. For civilians, It was the moment when the familiar flow of life was disrupted. But this was only the beginning. By May, that disruption had turned into a crack. On May 6, 2025, airports around Moscow were targeted again. Both runways and approach and departure corridors were under threat. Takeoffs were halted, landings were delayed, hundreds of flights were disrupted, thousands of passengers were glued to terminal screens. Civil aviation authorities used the phrase, "waiting for airspace security," for the first time. This phrase had become a protocol that even ordinary passengers had memorized. On May 25th, a similar scenario unfolded again. Once more, planes were unable to take off from Moscow airports. Some planes were even placed in a holding pattern in the air. That is, they were kept waiting for hours, circling before landing. These events were no longer coincidental. They were a pattern. In June, new attacks were added to this pattern. During the week of June 8th, flights were suspended once again due to waves of drones around Moscow and St. Petersburg. This development affected not only air traffic, but also everyday technological life. Navigation apps crashed, drivers got lost on the roads, and location services on cell phones malfunctioned. These disruptions were not just a few seconds long. Sometimes they lasted for hours and affected large areas. The impact of electronic warfare turned into a layer of pressure that the public could not see but could feel. On June 25th, Russian air defense announced it had shot down 114 UAVs. This was not just a numerical record. What was really noteworthy was the official emphasis on the phrase, simultaneous multi-zone attacks. Attacks were no longer coming from a specific front, but from all sides. Each attack scenario became a new stress test. By July, the picture had darkened further. On July 4th, a transformer station near Sergeyev Posad in the Moscow Oblast was hit. Energy infrastructure was now being targeted directly. This meant that emergency plans had to be taken off the shelf for every business and institution around the capital. The next day, July 5th, 4 more UAVs were shot down around Moscow. The attacks had become sequential. These pressures, coming 2 days in a row, created lasting anxiety in the minds of both operators and civilians. Even though the power outages were short-lived, the question, "When will it happen again?" had become the silent guest of every evening. On July 18th, the situation worsened. Flights were suspended at Domodedovo and Vnukovo airports due to drone attacks. This was a serious logistical crisis in the middle of the high season. Shortly thereafter, on July 20th, it was announced that 142 drones had been launched across Russia, and 117 of them had been shot down. 27 unmanned aerial vehicles were destroyed in the air in the Moscow region. This meant open warfare in the skies above the capital. Airlines began preparing backup airports and alternative slots for each flight. The end of August was a turning point for Moscow. On August 26th, simultaneous shutdowns occurred at 3 major airports around the capital. Flights were cancelled, panicked warnings were sent to passengers, and pilots were diverted from their routes. On the same day, raids coincided with fires and explosions in western regions. This was indicative of a multi-pronged attack strategy that spread not only to the capital, but across the country. Air defense resources around Moscow now had to be divided to other fronts. The capital was no longer fully protected. The night of September 1st became the latest link in this chain. According to official statements, 160 UAVs reached Russian territory in a single night, followed by another 152 UAVs in the days that followed. These enormous numbers were not just technical figures, but represented the erosion of the sense of security in a country's capital. The sky darkened, sirens blared, flights were cancelled, and the people waited in despair. 54% of Russians say the war has negatively affected their daily lives, either directly or indirectly. This percentage clearly reveals not only individual complaints, but also the social and economic tension created by the war on the home front. This shift shows that the victory-oriented nationalism atmosphere at the beginning of the war has given way to silent discontent. The legitimacy of the war in society is now being questioned. Support is gradually declining. For broad segments of the population, the war is no longer an abstract defense of the homeland. It means longer working hours, lower purchasing power, and less hope. According to research, 40% of the population reports working more than they did a few years ago. However, this increased workload is not reflected in their quality of life. People are working more, but they do not feel they are getting a better life in return. Only a small 6% say their workload has decreased. which shows that the vast majority of society is working at an increasing pace and wearing themselves out. The economic effects of the war are particularly visible in large cities. Rising living costs, salaries eroded by inflation, and soaring food prices are increasing the pressure on the working classes. In some sectors where layoffs are increasing, it is reported that more responsibilities are being placed on the remaining employees. This brings not only economic, but also psychological fatigue. This feeling of more effort, same or even lower standard of living, which is becoming widespread among the lower and middle classes, contradicts the Kremlin's official war rhetoric. Despite the propaganda presenting the war as a symbol of victory, unity, and strength, for a large segment of the population, this process means exhaustion and dissatisfaction. Of course, Ukraine's successive attacks play a major role in all these developments, and it seems that this window of opportunity for attacks is widening with each passing day. This is because Ukraine is not only maintaining its striking capabilities, but also constantly improving them. One of the striking developments this week was the first field use of Ukrainian-made Flamingo FP5 cruise missiles. Developed by Firepoint, this system is notable as a family of land-launched, domestically produced cruise missiles. The announced range is 3,000 kilometers. This means that not only Crimea and Donbass, but also bases in Volgograd, Kazan, and even the eastern Urals are theoretically within the range of this weapon. This missile, which is said to have a warhead capacity of over 1 ton, is designed to target much deeper objectives than the classic HIMARS or Storm Shadow systems currently in use. Although open-source information indicates that it is still in limited production, the emphasis on mass production capacity and operational precision is noteworthy. The fact that the first attack targeted a Russian airbase in Crimea shows that this missile represents not just a symbolic, but a strategic threshold. Another critical development is the US approval of the sale of 3,350 ERAMs to Ukraine. ERAMs are munitions launched from fighter jets, with a range of hundreds of miles and carrying extremely precise guidance systems. Their most notable feature is that they are designed specifically to strike hard targets. With the integration of this munition into the front lines, Ukraine will now have the potential to conduct night raids not only on the front lines, but also on Russia's rear logistics chain, radar systems, airstrips, and munitions depots. Although ERAMs do not directly target Moscow, they change the rhythm of the map in operational terms. In other words, they force the enemy to constantly rewrite its strategic plans. Another noteworthy system that has come to the fore recently is the new generation of long-range UAVs called Paralyzing. Unlike classic drones, this system has an autonomous architecture that operates on missile logic. Qualities such as low radar signature, AI-assisted guidance, and route learning during flight make this platform both difficult to detect and resistant to electronic jamming. The system's most important advantage is its ability to target multiple targets simultaneously, thanks to swarm coordination. Its ability to track routes and update targets, especially in electronic warfare environments, seriously challenges conventional defense systems. This represents a new phase that is both numerically and technically exhausting for Russian defense layers. When these 3 points are considered together, the picture emerging for the Kremlin is clear in one word: geography is shrinking. The Moscow area, which remained calm at the beginning of the war by saying, "The front is far from us," now routinely experiences high-risk scenarios, such as flight bans, airport shutdowns, radar conflicts, and emergency power backups. So where is the air defense system that should protect Moscow? Actually, it is there, but it is no longer sufficient. The layered air defense systems deployed in the Moscow region, such as the S-400, Pantsir S-1, and Tor M2, theoretically provide an impressive shield. It is even reported that more advanced systems, such as the S-500, have been deployed in limited numbers. However, Ukraine's methods of attack go far beyond classic threat definitions. Unmanned aerial vehicles, cruise missiles, electronic jamming, and simultaneous attacks from multiple directions are wearing down the Russian defense network. Moreover, these attacks are not limited to the air. Infrastructure such as radar systems, command centers, and transformer stations are also being targeted. This creates serious blind spots in the defense layers around Moscow. For example, the destruction of 2 separate S-400 radar systems in Crimea during attacks organized by Ukrainian intelligence on June 26th demonstrated how such technical interventions affect Moscow's defense balance. The sustainability of air defense systems is also being questioned. In particular, bottlenecks in the supply of short-range missiles used in the Pantsir and Tor systems are increasingly limiting the Kremlin's military resources. If the current trend continues, Russia could experience deep fractures in its internal balance in the coming period. In centers such as Moscow and St. Petersburg, homes are no longer being sold, hotels are not filling up, and investors are turning their attention elsewhere. Land under the threat of war does not promise an attractive future for anyone. The airspace can be closed at any moment. A drone alert stops not only flights, but also the flow of life. Railway delays and explosions in energy transmission lines disrupt production chains. When production slows down, prices on supermarket shelves rise. When this chain breaks, it's not just goods that run out, but people's patience too. Insurance companies are now cautious about operations around Moscow. Premiums are rising. Getting a product to the shelves is now more expensive, more risky, more fragile. But the economy isn't just about numbers. The real loss is the feeling of safety on the streets. In Russia's big cities, the question, will it fall on our neighborhood tonight, has become the inner voice of the people. Parks are empty, concerts are cancelled, theaters are closing their curtains, schools are closed for a few days at a time due to alarms. Cultural life has surrendered to a suspended uncertainty. Society is retreating into parody, introspection, and silence in the face of the collapse of the illusion of security. As anger mixed with humor spills over onto social media, rumors spreading on Telegram channels are swallowing up the truths of state media. Everyone is now looking for the truth elsewhere. The biggest migration is an invisible brain drain. Young, educated, and mobile Russians no longer see a future in this country. IT specialists, engineers, academics. While the doors are still open, suitcases are being packed. Staying is no longer a matter of courage, but of helplessness. And those left behind are waiting. Waiting for a new attack, a new announcement, a new blackout. Consumption is declining. No one wants to buy a car or move house, because there is no guarantee of the future. Everyone is cautious about time, fearful of their wallet. At the political level, the Kremlin's voice is no longer as strong as it used to be. What was Putin's biggest promise to his people for years? Security. Now that promise has been shattered. Radicals are filling this void. Nationalists who believe the war is not being waged harshly enough are raising their voices around figures like Gherkin. These circles, even more aggressive than the Kremlin, are slowly winning over public opinion. The cracks within the state, while not yet causing a major upheaval, clearly show the tension behind the wall. Information control is no longer sustainable. Images of soldiers at the front, leaked orders, reports of sabotage. There is a growing gap between what the state says and what the people see. This gap breeds not loyalty, but silence. And silence is the most dangerous silence for any authoritarian regime. In the military sphere, the crisis is now being experienced not only at the front, but also behind the front lines. Attacks on facilities such as Alabuga, Tambov, and Tula were blows to the heart of the production line. The lack of ammunition leaves factory workers as helpless as soldiers at the front. Mobilization capacity is running out. Prisoners were taken. Ethnic minority regions were pressured. Volunteers were persuaded. But now there are no more people to send to the front. The command structure is becoming increasingly reluctant. The targeted generals are afraid to make decisions. Orders are delayed. The logistics chain is faltering. And all this military structure is facing swarms of AI-controlled UAVs, radar-resistant platforms, and high-precision munitions guided by Western sensors. Russia still has a navy equipped with torpedoes and analog radars from the 90s. This is not just a technological gap, it is a generational gap. The outcome is clear. A revolution, a sudden collapse, or an uprising may not seem likely today. But this order is crumbling from within, day by day. The Kremlin can still instill fear, yes, but fear alone cannot sustain a state. A system that once kept all its gears turning now struggles to stay afloat in silence. The streets are silent, the crowds are silent, the televisions are silent. And this war is no longer just about territory. It is also being fought for the concept of security in the minds of a people. But unfortunately, Moscow no longer represents that security. Thank you for watching.
Shares of the Russian state energy company Gazprom on the Moscow exchange fell by a third at once.
Putin just lost the war. Since Russia launched its war against Ukraine, both the war economy and Western sanctions have severely crippled the Russian economy. The Russian army is a large force, and financing it is no easy task. Putin has found numerous ways to circumvent sanctions in order to both fund the military and keep the Russian economy afloat. It goes without saying that oil and natural gas are the Russian economy's largest sources of revenue. While oil exports were carried out by a shadow fleet, natural gas exports continued through private companies. These companies, which supplied Europe's gas needs in particular, were meeting demand despite being subject to sanctions. However, something unexpected happened, and Putin's largest gas exporter went bankrupt. Agreements with Europe were cancelled one by one. These cancellations led to layoffs and production coming to a standstill. This also affected the army. Fuel and ammunition supplies to the front lines decreased. The Ukrainian attacks also had a major impact on this. This is because Ukraine has systematically bombed Russia's oil and natural gas facilities over the last 2 to 3 months. Russia still has customers such as China and Iran, but this is not a short-term solution. Countries such as Turkey and India are also still among the largest buyers of Russian gas. However, China, the largest buyer, is no longer showing demand for Russian gas. The decline in Russian gas has pushed the Chinese government to take measures against Russia. Putin had placed a great deal of trust in Xi Jinping, especially regarding natural gas. But after recent events, Xi Jinping decided to meet China's natural gas needs from overseas suppliers, such as Canada. The uncertainty surrounding the war in Ukraine prompted the Chinese government, with its large population, to adopt an emergency action plan. So, what was the reason that negatively affected Russian oil and natural gas sales to such an extent? From the money in people's pockets to the bullets fired on the front lines. Of course, it was the collapse of Gazprom. Is the European chapter for Russian gas truly over? Is there any chance of a comeback? Yes, the European chapter is now closed. In 2021, Russia's share of Europe's natural gas consumption was approximately 40%. Within 2 years, this picture has been reversed. In 2024, this share fell below 20%. Although there were small fluctuations in some months, the general trend is downward. The flow of gas to Europe via pipelines has fallen to near zero. On top of that, on January 1st, 2025, the last major land transit corridor via Ukraine effectively ended. Europe filled this gap with flows from Norway, global LNG, North African connections, and demand management. Storage was also used in a disciplined manner. Brussels' line is clear. The share of Russian gas will remain low. Moreover, tools to restrict Russian LNG are ready. Russia's "I'll return to Europe" card is no longer credible. This means the core of Gazprom's old business model is gone. In September 2025, Moscow announced a legally binding POS2 agreement. This sounded like a major leap forward, but the deal is hollow because the sales price was not disclosed. Without a price, there is no final investment decision, and banks will not provide long-term loans for the pipeline without a contract price. Financing must be secured before construction begins. Without financing, the project won't get off the ground. In short, the phrases "we've started politically" and "money is starting to flow into the coffers" are not the same thing. The real start of POS2 depends on the price formula being signed and the debt-equity balance being established based on that price. China is sitting strong at the table. It has alternative sources such as Central Asian pipeline gas and a broad LNG portfolio. But time is on its side, and it knows Russia's options are limited. In 2024, approximately 31 billion cubic meters of gas went to China from the POS1 line. The target is 38. This may sound like a lot, but it pales in comparison to the 150 billion cubic meters transported to Europe in 2021. POS2 could technically handle 50 billion cubic meters or more, but it still doesn't compensate for the peak volume in Europe. The real critical difference is in the margin. China's net price has historically been lower than Europe's, so even if the volume increases, profitability remains the same. That's why China's interest is not to keep Moscow alive with high prices. It's to secure long-term, reliable supply at a reasonable price. Speaking in terms of numbers, how did Gazprom get into such a mess? 2 lines in the current table sum it all up. In 2023, Gazprom posted a net loss of approximately 629 billion rubles. This was one of the toughest years in the company's history. In 2024, the picture turned positive, with a net profit of approximately 1.2 trillion rubles. But a critical decision was made. No dividends. Because cash is fragile. Interest rates are high. External costs such as insurance and freight are expensive. Investments are long-term, and market visibility is low. The profit seen on paper does not elicit a sigh of relief. It reinforces the reflex to keep cash inside. This decision not only upsets shareholders, it also affects the federal budget. In Russia, oil and gas revenues still account for about 1/3 of state revenues. At the same time, defense and security spending exceeded 40% of total spending. So, if energy revenues fall, the war budget falls by the same amount. How are Ukraine's refinery and pipeline attacks draining the coffers? This is where the cheap attack, expensive defense part of the equation comes into play. Throughout 2024 to 2025, UAVs, swarm drones, and long-range munitions frequently struck refineries, pipeline pumping stations, railway fuel hubs, and port terminal areas. At times, at least 17% of operating refinery capacity was shut down. This meant gasoline shortages domestically, per-person sales limits at stations, and occasional closures. Internationally, exports were restricted or halted twice. To do a quick calculation, if 800,000 barrels per day of refinery capacity were out of service for 7 days, 5.6 million barrels would not be processed. Assuming $75 per barrel, $420 million in gross sales would be delayed or lost. If the 250,000 barrels per day flow in the southern branch of the Druzhba pipeline were to stop for 3 days, the gross flow loss would be 750,000 barrels times $75 equals $56 million. Low-cost attacks produce high-cost, cascading disruptions. Moreover, a single blow is not enough. Insurance policies are thickening, freight rates are rising, and wait times are lengthening. As a result, even if tonnage increases, net revenue per barrel is declining. Meanwhile, there is a donation campaign for Ukraine by UNITED24 in the video description. If you want to take part in the fight for freedom, we are waiting for your support. Now let's get back to our main topic. Gazprom posted a profit in 2024, but did not distribute dividends. This has two implications. First, management considers the approaching uncertainty and investment needs more important than profit. Distributing dividends before the price of POS2 is locked in, financing is secured, and construction begins is like throwing away your umbrella when it rains. Second, the burden of internal dampers and subsidies is growing. The public treasury steps in to keep pump prices stable during refinery outages. If discounts are given externally while assistance grows internally, the budget is squeezed from two sides. Therefore, the answer to the question, there is profit, why no dividends, is not just accounting, it is strategy. Keeping the cash inside is seen as more valuable than short-term applause. So, why is the geographical and security risk of POS2 so high? POS2 is a line exceeding 2,600 kilometers. It will pass through Mongolia and cover a large area within Russia. Considering the pace of attacks on energy infrastructure over the past 2 years, this linear project is a prime target. The theoretical daily flow is roughly 137 million cubic meters. Just a 5-day interruption would mean a delay in the delivery of 685 million cubic meters. Assuming a net price of $250 per 1,000 cubic meters, this would result in a gross sales impact of $171 million. This does not include additional costs such as insurance, contract penalties, and financing. Moreover, but even before the pipeline is buried, the price is still unsigned. Banks and funds will not make an early opening under these conditions. It is not the pipeline itself, but the combination of price and security that makes it profitable. Currently, the former is absent, and the latter is expensive. How much is the European loss straining GDP and the defense budget? The collapse in sales to Europe has created a permanent contraction in foreign trade. Consider the total gas flow to Europe in 2021 at 150 billion cubic meters. By 2024, this has fallen to 52 billion cubic meters. Depending on prices, a net export loss of $20 to $30 billion per year is a reasonable estimate. Take nominal GDP at $2 trillion. This loss translates to a permanent pain in the 1 to 1.5% range. At the same time, defense security spending exceeds 40% of the total budget. Any disruption in energy cash flow directly impacts defense financing through taxes and dividends. In short, if the energy ruble sneezes, the war budget catches a cold. But is there really a risk of mass layoffs? And is the word bankruptcy realistic? The bankruptcy claim is exaggerated, but destructive dynamics are accumulating. Gazprom's direct and indirect employment has long been in the 470 to 500,000 range. If the cash flow tightens, POS2 extends, and external costs remain sticky, a gradual downsizing of the payroll becomes inevitable. Let's do a simple calculation. A 2 to 3% reduction means 10 to 15,000 people. If you take the total annual cost per person as 1.5 million rubles, expenses would decrease by 15 to 22.5 billion rubles. A 5% contraction means 25,000 people, 37.5 billion rubles. A 7 to 8% contraction means 35 to 40,000 people, 52.5 to 60 billion rubles. These are rough estimates, but they show the direction. Instead of bankruptcy, we will talk more about this. Profit without dividends, delayed investment, shrinking payroll, and low margins. This is a path that locks the company's value in the lower band, and this path is also stifling the Kremlin. Putin used the energy weapon as leverage over Europe for years. That leverage has reversed in 2 years. The EU side has systematized alternative supply, storage, and demand management. Dependence on Russian gas has permanently declined. Moscow's hope for a comeback remains politically and economically weak. At the same time, it has approached the risk of being the sole buyer in the Asian market. China buys, but at what price? The answer to this question is clear, in its favor. This is why POS2 remains on paper. Without a price lock, neither the pipeline nor the cash will flow. The statement that even China cannot save Russia is not a slogan, but a summary of the real balance on the table. China's strategic goal is not expensive Russian gas. It is cheap and secure supply. That's why it's not rushing. It's suppressing the price, shifting the financing risk to Moscow. Ukraine's strategy on the energy front is also cornering Putin. Every new blow to refineries and pipeline pumping stations triggers dozens of items simultaneously, from spare parts to automation testing. The news that the fire is out is not a solution for the economy. It is only security. The solution is a return to safe and full capacity. The longer this return takes, the greater the squeeze in the domestic market and the additional costs in the foreign market. Even as export tonnage increases, net revenue per barrel is shrinking. The damper is growing to keep prices at the pump domestically. This two-sided pressure produces a signal of unsustainability over time. This signal is heard not only in the economy, but also in military logistics. As the fuel window narrows, armored movement becomes sparse, artillery density decreases, and air defense patrols become shorter. The link between the energy front and the military front is measured in daily rhythm. The short answer to the question, is Gazprom going under, is still not today. But let's expand the question. If the ground supporting Gazprom collapses, how long can Putin hold out? That is the critical point. Europe is a permanent loss. China is driving down prices. POS2 is free. Attack cycles are expensive. Insurance and freight are sticky. Dampers are expensive domestically. There are no dividends, and payroll cuts are on the horizon. This is a picture of breathlessness. Not for a company, but for a war economy. Xi can project a political image, sign in front of cameras. But unless he raises the price of POS2 and closes the financing, that signature won't translate into cash. Xi's timeline is patient, his bargaining tough. Russia's timeline demands quick cash. Since the two timelines don't align, they say, even Xi can't save it. So, which line will prevail in the next 12 months? There are 3 possibilities. First, good but late. POS2 reaches the mid-range price. FID is issued. The construction site opens. Cash flow is positive, but margins are tight. Dividends are still off the agenda. Second, China pressure. The price is locked in the low band. Volume comes in, but profitability erodes. The capex debt balance comes under stress, leading to greater payroll cuts and pressure to sell assets. Third, political premium. Initially, the price appears high, and a "we've started" photo is taken. But in the medium term, formula revisions and discounts come into play. The common thread in all 3 scenarios remains unchanged. POS2's transition from paper debt to cash debt is based on price and security. The price is still unknown. Security is expensive. As a result, Putin's helplessness is clear. A country that has lost the European market and approached China as its sole buyer cannot set the price. While the domestic energy infrastructure is being worn down by low-cost attacks, insurance, freight, and wait days create a sticky cost abroad. As export tonnage increases, net income shrinks. Domestically, the damper grows to keep prices at the pump. The federal budget is squeezed from both sides. There are no dividends. Payroll shrinks with delays. Instead of, is Gazprom going under? The more accurate question is, how sustainable is this pace? The answer lies in the price of POS2, the speed of the attack cycle, and the closing of the damper scissors domestically. Unless all three are resolved, the picture will worsen. Gazprom's great replacement after Europe is still only on paper today. Massive losses in 2023, profits in 2024 but no dividends. Costly defense in the refinery, pipeline, port triangle in 2025. There is no salvation without the price of POS2 being tied to the signature, without insurance freight and the weight regime being relaxed, and without the damper scissors closing internally. Even Xi cannot save Putin in this state, because the issue is price. One has applause, the other has money. In today's energy chess game, the key to money is in the buyer's hands. So, what do you think about this? Please share your thoughts in the comments. To stay updated on new videos, please subscribe to our channel and don't forget to turn on notifications. Thank you for watching. Polish airspace was put on high alert early Wednesday morning, September 10th. And this time, it wasn't just about the war across the border. The Polish military's radars simultaneously tracked multiple unmanned aerial vehicles, triggering the command and control chain within seconds. Fighter jets took off. Ground-based air defense batteries took up firing positions, and airspace was gradually restricted. The Polish Air Force and NATO were on high alert. The Polish Armed Forces Operations Command confirmed that the country's airspace had been repeatedly violated by Russian shaded-type UAVs. This Russian attack was a move that would trigger NATO's Article 5. Warsaw government officials argued that this was not a violation, but an act of aggression, directly targeting the safety of civilians. NATO jets shot down Russian drones that repeatedly violated Polish airspace during a nighttime bombing raid on Ukraine. Poland announced that 4 of the 19 drones that entered Russian airspace were shot down. While citizens were urged to stay indoors, fighter jets belonging to Poland, the Netherlands, and Italy took off to intercept more than 10 drones. Polish F-16 fighter jets, Dutch F-35s, Italian AWACS surveillance aircraft, and NATO shared aerial refueling aircraft participated in the operation, which lasted throughout the night. Polish Defense Minister Cezary Tomczyk stated that the Polish President and Prime Minister had been informed that an operation had been launched to neutralize the objects violating Polish airspace. Subsequently, official statements were made one after another that the Russian drones had been shot down and that a search was underway for the fallen wreckage. It was reported that the Russian unmanned aerial vehicles were approximately 40 kilometers deep inside Polish airspace before being shot down. Warnings were issued to the Polish public to stay indoors and report any falling debris. Warsaw government officials ordered approximately 8.7 million people, constituting about a quarter of Poland's population, to stay at home. This situation once again demonstrated that border violations are not just tired news, but a threshold with the risk of escalation. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk announced that they were in constant contact with the NATO Secretary General and that Allied forces had also been deployed. Donald Tusk said that an operation is underway regarding the multiple violations of Polish airspace. The army used weapons against the targets. I am in constant contact with the President and the Minister of Defense. Since the start of the war in Ukraine, the most serious conflict between Russia and the alliance has escalated the conflict to an unprecedented level. Poland, as a NATO member, is protected under Article 5. This was the first time NATO aircraft had been deployed against potential threats in Allied airspace, he said, adding that NATO Patriot air defense systems in the region detected the drones but were not deployed. A spokesperson said the alliance would meet today to discuss how to respond. This failure was due, at least, to the fact that Russia's lethal drones did not cause any casualties in Poland. Had they not been shot down in an air defense operation involving F-35 jets from the Netherlands, the situation could have been different. For this reason, Donald Tusk called for the implementation of Article 4 of the NATO agreement in his speech to Parliament. Article 4 gives member states the authority to refer a matter to the main political decision-making body. Tusk said, "The downing of these unmanned aerial vehicles, which pose a security threat, changes the political situation." Therefore, Allied consultations took the form of a formal request to activate Article 4 of the NATO treaty. This paves the way for Article 5. NATO did not formally invoke Article 5, but it did effectively implement it. Allied capitals warned in joint statements that a repeat would come at a cost, with more severe consequences. US President Donald Trump said that, "We must impose sanctions that will bankrupt the Russian war machine and arm Ukraine with weapons capable of striking Russia." US Representative Joe Wilson said, "Russia is attacking NATO ally Poland with Iranian-made Shahed UAVs. This is an act of war. We are grateful for the swift response of NATO allies." These statements showed how NATO and Poland are cooperating against Russia's UAV attack attempt, and that Article 5 could be invoked at any moment. Along with the current moves being made here, we should also look at what could happen in a 72-hour response simulation of possible moves regarding Russia's UAV dispatch crisis against Poland. It was announced that Chelm and Zamość were among the cities under threat. After such a move, cap intensity would be increased and GBAD echelons redeployed within the first 12 hours. CAOC would intensify its plan to take over patrols from neighboring airspace and transition from tanker to tanker. This is indeed what happened. The most critical note from a military perspective was the first statement. Poland announced that it had neutralized the violating drones with its own and allied assets, and emphasized this point. Radars tracked more than 10 objects simultaneously, and those deemed a threat were directed for destruction. Troops on the ground established a security perimeter around potential crash sites and initiated a chain of custody for evidence. Air policing was integrated with air defense and operated in an aggressive manner during this incident. Allied fighter jets, directed by CAOC, established layered CAP combat air patrol rings in Polish airspace. Patriot and short-range systems went on standby for a possible second wave and debris risk. The AWACS and tanker duo extended their watch periods and maintained a higher resolution radar image. The initial response in Allied capitals to the crisis Russia created in Poland took the form of visible and rapid deterrence. Warplanes, early warning aircraft, and aerial refueling aircraft belonging to Germany, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Poland were mobilized to defend Polish airspace against Russian drone attacks. Romania, Poland, and the Netherlands deployed F-16, F-35, and SAAB 340 AWACS warplanes. The sound of fighter jets continued to be heard in the skies over Lublin in eastern Poland. East of the border, the passive sensor network overlooking low-altitude corridors is being expanded. The electronic environment towards Belarus and Kaliningrad is constantly monitored, and anomalies are flagged. Civil air traffic is being diverted further north and west during risky windows. That day, several airports, including Warsaw Chopin, were temporarily closed, and planes were redirected to different airports within the country. In addition to Chopin Airport, the other three airports that were closed were Rzeszów-Jasionka Airport, Warsaw-Modlin Airport, and Lublin Airport, which are the main centers for supplying weapons to Ukraine. In addition, both air defense and ground-based air defense systems were simultaneously reinforced in Poland. Airspace surveillance flights, tanker aircraft escorts, and forward transport routes were reorganized. Restrictions were imposed on certain routes as a risk mitigation measure for civil aviation. While airports were temporarily closed, NATO's CAOC chain continued to manage QRA flights. At the land border, certain gates were closed and search and screening practices were stepped up. At the end of the first night, the cycle of wreckage and data collection and verification began. In Poland, local law enforcement units were involved in wreckage management, the chain of custody, and source identification. The public was informed in a clear and calm tone to reduce the burden of false reports. The surprise element was that the violation showed a recurring nature overnight. This recurrence weakened the accident thesis and strengthened the test thesis. Between 12 and 24 hours, official notes and Allied joint statements arrive via diplomatic channels. In the 24 to 72-hour window, if the incident recurs, the engagement threshold is raised. For this reason, the multi-zone alert signaled the geographical breadth of the operation. All of this was a vivid example of how the UAV era changed border security overnight. The electronic warfare front further complicated the tactical picture on the ground. GPS jamming reports could cause occasional deviations in civil aviation and land navigation. Poland therefore re-established civil routes during specific time windows. On the military side, inertial and multi-sensor fusion tracking algorithms mitigate the blackout effect. Electro-optical and passive sensor contributions are important for low-altitude, slow-moving targets. Allied AWACS play a critical role in separating the signal image from background noise. Jamming tires radar operators by producing false targets and reflection trails. Therefore, command centers tightened the verification chain and made the firing permission threshold explicit. The field application was an attempt to balance reducing false engagements while maintaining reaction time. The result was a high-tempo but controlled engagement behavior. In this simulation, the risk of false alarms and false engagements can never be eliminated. A complex electromagnetic environment, especially on busy nights, makes target discrimination difficult. Therefore, the rule of multiple sensors and multiple confirmations remains critical. Firing measured shots without compromising speed at the same time is a matter of training and discipline. On the other hand, Poland's engagement rules also kept in mind the tragic incident involving a missile from another country in 2022. That incident raised persistent questions about whose weapon it was, at what altitude, and what the threat conversion rate was. Therefore, today's scenario relied on radar EO double confirmation and the principle of striking away from civilians. For this reason, NATO frequently works on cross-border shadow target scenarios in joint exercises. Deconfliction protocols reduce the risk of accidents, especially in battery jet interactions. In the age of UAVs, low-cost threats continue to strain expensive defenses. In this equation of strain, logistics and maintenance tempo are also part of deterrence. In short, sustainability up to the right shot at the right time is also decisive. Thus, the deterrence threshold was reiterated without resorting to a formal invocation of Article 5. This warning window in Poland occurred 3 days after Russia launched an intense nighttime assault on western Ukraine. A record-breaking wave of over 800 UAVs and dozens of missiles targeting Kyiv had already shaped the remainder of the night. While Ukrainian sources reported fires affecting the government complex in the capital, sirens continued to sound in western provinces. Now, a real test was unfolding at Polish altitude. This critical situation marked one of the sharpest alarm moments for NATO air policing in the 2-year war. On the other side of the border, successive flashes on Poland's radar screen turned the air picture from grey to red. This pattern was seen as Moscow's tactic of testing NATO's threshold while putting pressure on Ukraine. The Ukrainian Air Force's initial sharing of the Zamość threat warning, then retracting it, increased the uncertainty of information. This also showed how fragile public communication can be on a night of active attack. Nevertheless, Poland's official stance remained clear. There was a violation, Poland and NATO intervened, and the border was secured. The Belarus layer was not a passive backdrop in this crisis, but an active line of tension. Due to the exercise schedule spreading across the region, Poland had previously announced that it would close its border with Belarus. This decision created a preventive barrier at the point where border security and hybrid pressure converged. The Belarusian territory is known for its low-altitude corridors, suitable for UAV flights and electronic jamming sources. It is known that large-scale exercise periods, such as Zapad, put pressure on civilian military traffic at the border. Different situations were observed in Belarus during Russia's UAV attacks on Poland. In addition to UAVs entering Polish airspace, the Belarusian Air Force was currently hunting down rogue Shaheds in its airspace. Poland and the Baltics increased their patrol and scanning intensity during the same time window. Logistics and migration issues created complementary pressure that reinforced the security card. Guidance documents for civilians were delivered to local authorities, along with a CLED-style incident maps. Thus, the airspace alert and land border measures became two sides of the same scenario. The result was that the picture became more fluid when the Belarus variable was added. From Russia's perspective, there is no single answer to the question of what this pattern of behavior, i.e. sending UAVs to Poland, signifies. One interpretation is that it is a test of NATO's reaction time and political unity. Another interpretation is to pin NATO to the defense line during high-intensity nights against Ukraine. In both interpretations, the goal may be to multiply decision moments and increase the possibility of error. The way to counter this is to shorten the reaction time without compromising the quality of verification. Allies therefore use joint training, joint communication, and a common legal language. Energy sanctions and secondary sanctions are being prepared as the economic arm of the military message. When these legs walk in unison, the payoff of the testing game decreases. This is how the border can cease to be a testing ground. The gain is deterrence without the need to fire a shot. The Eastern European equation is being redrawn with sharper lines after this incident. Finland and the Baltics are thickening the air-land sensor network from north to south. The Suwalki corridor is gaining a constant patrol rhythm from the air and on the ground. Within Poland, permanent site plans for air defense installations are accelerating. The civilian-military distinction is being clarified along the Rzeszów line, which is close to Ukrainian logistics. Passive protection and fire prevention measures are being enhanced at railway and highway junctions. The emergency production capacity of local industry is being integrated into defense plans. These steps point to a permanent border security architecture, not a one-night affair. The consequences of this crisis are not calm on the Western Front, but a systematic state of alert. And this order is accepted as the new normal in the age of UAVs. The crisis created by Russia in Polish airspace and its simultaneity with the Ukrainian front should never be forgotten. When Russia increases the intensity of its attacks towards the west, sirens sound in the Lviv-Volyn window. This pressure automatically increases the pace of air policing at the NATO border. The sharing of Ukraine's air defense and Poland's air picture is therefore critical. The security of the logistics flow is not just a matter for one country, but for the supply chain. When drones are shot down, debris and wreckage can sometimes fall on the other side of the border. This technical detail can trigger discussions about sovereignty and jurisdiction. Therefore, joint incident site management and evidence protocols are being worked on. To remain calm in the field, pre-written texts are needed at the table. Crisis management depends as much on the quality of preparation as on the accuracy of communication. As we approach the final stages, let's put the possible outcomes that could occur in the coming period on the table. The first scenario is a non-recurring violation and dampening with a strong message. In this case, the Allies settle for a package of sanctions and military visibility. The second scenario is repeated violations and earlier engagement. Here, CAP-GBAD thresholds are lowered and the shoot-down cycle accelerates. The third scenario is Belarusian involvement and simultaneous pressure. Joint pressure on the land-air border requires multiple tasks on NATO's eastern flank. The fourth scenario involves accidental escalation and an emergency de-escalation line. At this stage, diplomatic channels and leader-level telephone diplomacy come into play. What remains constant in all scenarios is the meticulous maintenance of the confirm, engage, verify chain. Considering all that has happened, the few minutes of violation in Polish airspace rewrote NATO's entire night. Every step, from the rapid takeoff of jets to the closure of airports, carried a message. The message was addressed to Moscow, but the recipient was the entire alliance. It was said that this test game is expensive and will become even more so. Even in moments of intense uncertainty, the line of law and discipline was not crossed. The line between staying alert and not escalating is delicate, but it can be maintained. The key to this is the simultaneous operation of training, sensor fusion, and a common language. In Eastern Europe, this line now seems to be part of everyday life. A lesson learned overnight can produce a reflex that will be useful for years to come. And that reflex is called hearing the voice of the border instantly and giving the right response. Thank you for watching. Russia aimed to crush Ukraine with two armies that formed the backbone of its ground forces. The 41st and 20th Guards Combined Arms Armies were deployed as the core of this plan. These units had been moved from front to front since the first days of the war. They had been worn down on almost every front, from the gates of Kiev to the industrial belt of Donbass. Rotations were short, and resupply had been intermittent for 2 years. The organizational charts were static on paper, but the depth on the ground was eroding. Ukraine entered these weary focal points from an unexpected place. It opened a window targeting the chain of command. It locked down 2 separate headquarters in the heart of Donetsk at the same minute. At that moment, the initiative left the table. The attack took place around 7:30 p.m. 5 jet-powered Peklo unmanned aerial vehicles descended on the area at low altitude and in a vertical dive. In this attack, Ukraine integrated not only its newly developed domestic missiles, but also Storm Shadow cruise missiles procured from the west. A series of explosions then rocked 2 separate points. It was clear from the outset that the targets were not chosen at random. The steep dive angle seen in video recordings, multiple hits, and virtually zero air defense response proved that this operation had been planned for a long time and prepared with a multi-point surveillance network. The first hit shut down the forward command node inside the Topaz facilities. The second salvo struck the division headquarters at the Donetsk metallurgical plant site. There was barely a breath of a gap between the explosions. The surrounding air defense layer failed to respond in the first minute. The first counterfire came after the explosions. The targets had already been destroyed by then. It was immediately clear that the targets had not been chosen at random. One of the targets of the attack was the Topaz site. This served as the forward command center for the Russian ground forces 41st Guards Combined Arms Army. The fact that the attack was directed specifically at this headquarters was no coincidence. This is because the current commander of the 41st Army, Sergei Rykov, is alleged to have been among the initial planners of the 2022 invasion. On the other hand, this location has been known for electronic production since the Soviet era. Traces of Kolchuga and derivative systems remain in this field. After 2014, new functions were assigned behind the control line. Military command subsystems clustered here. Logistics lines were organized for advanced command vehicles. The settlement became both a symbol and a node. When struck, its impact drew a wide circle. This circle grew around orders and signals. The symbol and the node were broken simultaneously. Another target was the metallurgy site, where the 20th Army's headquarters was located. Setting up a temporary headquarters within heavy industry provides a concealment advantage. Noise and heat signatures are masked. Ceiling height facilitates antenna and cabling. When hit, however, the risk of fire increases. Steel and fuel together create danger. Access to shelters is blocked by debris. Vehicle parking areas remain elevated. When the terminal strike is from above, the escape area narrows. That night, this is exactly what happened. Moreover, the timing of these attacks was absolutely simultaneous and could not be explained by coincidence. The approach directions relied on radar blind spots. Shelter entrances and communications nodes were marked separately. The terminal's dive angles amplified the impact of the overhead strike. The building's communications core was taken out in a single shot. The backup generator rooms were disabled by the second strike. The command vehicle's parking area took the third hit. The escape routes were filled with debris. However, the Russian side's first response was to seal off the area. The debris was quickly covered up, and the flow of images was curtailed. Official channels circulated the claim that the targets were worthless. Independent images quickly disproved this narrative. Ambulance and fire department movements were recorded throughout the night. Cranes worked until morning. The perimeter of the compound was cordoned off with military tape. Nearby streets were closed to traffic. Communication restrictions were expanded. The military consequences were even more severe. The first physical result was seen in the headquarters' communication backbone. Equipped planning officers were suddenly left without communication. Network gateways and router rooms became inoperable. The load on field communication vehicles increased. Wired backup lines were damaged. Encrypted networks were shut down for security. Phones fell silent, and paper orders took over. It was as if a photograph had been swept off the table and thrown on the floor. Hourly plans stretched into days, and this delay grew toward the front lines. When the command control loop is severed, the artillery cycle suffers the fastest loss. Ammunition allocation becomes irregular, and target lists arrive late. Batteries revert to their own observation, and effectiveness declines. Counter-battery fire hits the wrong window. The language between the forward observer and the artillery is severed. The evaluation time for UAV imagery lengthens. When target approvals are delayed, the window of opportunity closes. The departure times of logistics convoys are postponed. Wounded evacuation plans falter. Small delays accumulate into a large gap. The second major consequence was seen in maneuver plans. Wing pressures experienced a loss of coordination. Armored thrusts waited for reserve fuel. Tactical commanders were forced to make local decisions. Local decisions reduced risk appetite. Low-risk attacks produced low returns. Short window targets were missed. The phrase, "wait for the decision," lingered in the trenches. The tempo of operations shifted from hourly to daily. The enemy turned these gaps into opportunities. Meanwhile, there is a donation campaign for Ukraine by United24 in the video description. If you want to take part in the fight for freedom, we are waiting for your support. Now let's get back to our main topic. The third consequence was psychological. Two industrial areas, seen as the heart of Donetsk, were military nodes. Striking these nodes shattered the perception of an untouchable zone. Personnel serving behind the front lines no longer felt secure. A flurry of transfers began at the command level. Shelters filled up and work areas were divided. Meetings became shorter and decisions were delayed. The search for who pointed out the target strained institutions. Internal security units launched investigations. The language of accusation stifled production and planning. Ukraine achieved all this with a single operation. And this pinpoint operation contains some fundamental elements that will change the course of the war. These elements are doctrinal depth and critical weaknesses in air defense systems. First, the decapitation doctrine is no longer just a concept. It has become a systematic pressure strategy with real-world implications. The Ukrainian army has moved from total resistance in the first months of the war to a three-stage strategy that is now being executed with almost clinical precision. The first step in this strategy is to blind the air defense umbrella. Attacks on the Nebo-M and Podlet radar systems in recent weeks form the first link in this chain. When the radars are silenced, the sky becomes permeable to the enemy. The second stage is to paralyze logistics. Ukraine has targeted Russian fuel supply systems across a wide spectrum, from the Prokhovka refinery in Belgorod to Tatarstan, and even the fuel infrastructure in Volgograd. Refinery explosions, the disabling of pipeline connection points, and the blowing up of ammunition depots were moves to starve Russia's war machine. And finally, the third stage, severing the chain of command. The strikes on areas such as the Topaz Electronics Factory and the Donetsk Metallurgical Complex correspond precisely to this third stage of the doctrine. These targets carry not only a structural, but also a symbolic message. Right in the heart of the territory Russia has considered untouchable since 2014, command and control systems are no longer secure. The second element, no less striking than the first, is the stark reality of the collapse of the air defense umbrella. In the minutes following the attack, video footage from the region showed that the air defense systems were almost completely ineffective. As the 5 jet-powered Peklo drones dove toward their target one after another, no counterfire was opened for the first few minutes. This leads us to conclude that Peklo is a platform designed architecturally to exploit precisely these gaps. Peklo's development process is a direct result of Ukraine's goal to reduce its dependence on Western platforms and build its own strategic strike force. It was announced that serial production of the missile began in December 2024, with a target production capacity of approximately 100 units per month. This production pace points to an infrastructure that will both increase Ukraine's ability to pressure targets with strategic depth and strengthen the sustainability of the war in terms of long-term ammunition consumption. From a technical standpoint, Peklo is powered by a jet engine and travels at a speed of approximately 700 kilometers per hour. This makes it an effective threat against low-level air defenses, and thanks to its ability to fly at high speed at low altitude, allows it to penetrate under classic radar shields. Peklo's range is stated to be around 700 kilometers, which transforms it into a pressure platform targeting objectives far beyond the front line. The missile's design was created with a high-efficiency, low-cost philosophy. The fact that it is produced with approximately 70% domestic content reduces dependence on external supply chains and provides a significant advantage in terms of long-term war economy. Ukraine's ability to create a function similar to Western cruise missiles with its own engineering can be considered a serious turning point in terms of war technology. In this sense, Peklo can be defined as a domestic and national storm shadow, only more compact, cheaper, and more suitable for mass production. The size of the missile's warhead is officially classified. However, according to independent analyses, the warhead it carries is approximately 50 kilograms. While this weight does not cause large-scale destruction in soft targets, it is extremely effective against strategic infrastructure such as headquarters, ammunition depots, and communication stations. Moreover, this destruction often occurs on systems caught off guard, thanks to the missile's flight profile, which makes tracking it before it reaches its target nearly impossible. Ukraine's asymmetric capabilities are increasingly turning the Kremlin's war machine, built with iron gears, into a pile of malfunctioning cogs. The recent attacks in Donetsk are just one example. In reality, Russia's weary front is no longer just being hit, it is systematically unraveling. Moreover, this collapse is not limited to the loss of a few artillery batteries or armored battalions. It is a deep military deformation with geographical, strategic, and doctrinal dimensions. Today, the battlefield is no longer read through a map of territory. It is read through a network of data. Satellite imagery, precise GPS coordinates, video feeds from unmanned aerial vehicles, and independent analyses based on real-time frontline reports reveal, in numbers, how inefficient Russia's performance has been since the start of the war. For example, since the large-scale offensive began in April 2022, Russia's net gain in Ukrainian territory is only about 5,000 square kilometers. This figure may look large on a map, but in real terms, it is only half the size of Lebanon. Moreover, this gain consists not of direct and strategic victories, but of areas taken inch by inch, often at great cost, and frequently lost again. These gains have essentially been concentrated in three narrow areas, around Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and small advances along the Donetsk administrative border. Bakhmut was captured in May 2023 after a siege lasting approximately 9 months. Avdiivka fell in February 2024 after 4 months of continuous attacks. However, the cost behind these advances is measured not only in ammunition or fuel, but in blood and bodies. A detailed analysis of Avdiivka by the Center for Strategic and International Studies starkly reveals this reality. Despite being supported by intense artillery and FAB-500 glide bombs, a Russian assault group of approximately 40,000 managed to gain control of only 9 kilometers of territory. The average advance speed was 75 meters per day. Furthermore, the Russian casualties incurred for this advance were approximately 18,000. In other words, 1 human life was sacrificed for every 4 meters of advance. This brutal balance now calls into question the validity of classic concepts of war. The modern battlefield is now transparent. In an environment filled with commercial satellites, fixed-wing drones, and sensors, large troop movements can be targeted before they even shift position. This transforms the large-scale armored assaults that succeeded in the 20th century into suicide missions in the 21st century. The Russian army is responding to this new reality with a kind of regression. The most common scenario seen on the battlefield today is a modern version of the stormtroops of World War I. Attack groups of 10 to 15 people are brought to the front in civilian motorcycles or off-road vehicles in the early morning or on foggy days to hide their electromagnetic traces. The goal is not to gain ground, but to expose enemy positions. If the trenches are reached, the positions inside are marked, and artillery, drones, or glide bombs are dropped on these points shortly thereafter. However, the scalability of this approach is limited. While some results are achieved at the squad level, operational level objectives are mostly missed. Capturing a single trench line requires hundreds of casualties. Moreover, control of these trenches does not last long. Thanks to Ukraine's higher quality intelligence infrastructure and deeply integrated artillery air coordination, all gains can be recaptured within hours with a single counterattack. Under these conditions, every meter Russia gains is not actually progress, but a geographical imprint of attrition. While the Kremlin remains fixated on the Soviet-style fetish of seize land, plant the flag, Ukraine is waging a much lower-cost but smarter war, a strategy equipped with radar jamming, fuel cutting, headquarters striking, and coordinated cyber-kinetic strikes. And this strategy is working. War is now being fought not only with tanks, but also between the lines. The mud of the front line is not just soil, it also bears the traces of plans, propaganda, and the initiative that Moscow has now lost. If you want to follow this war not just with numbers, but with strategies, human stories, and deep analysis, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Remember, war is won not only on the front lines, but also in knowledge and awareness. See you soon.